anything else? We're all good. Okay. So if you could bring up the first talk, I selfishly put myself at the front of this session simply out of hierarchical scale. So what I'm going to present is a very large overview of the meat trade, and the rest of the 3 sessions are going to progressively go from global to regional to local presentations. And hopefully the idea is that this global context will really help each of us understand the results that are being presented in a particular locality. So just to keep myself on time, so we heard an amazing co-presentation, which also a shout out to those guys, because that was awesome to see 2 people presenting like that together with such incredible work on the global fin trade. And the global fin trade has led to quite a lot of action, not only with CITES listings, which is listed here in red, but also with policies like fins attached policies. So if you're landing a shark fin, it has to be attached to a body, with the idea that you're not going to just fill your hold with fins. But the successes in organizing those various policies have led to concerns about what's happened with the bodies. So now that we have possibly more bodies coming in, what's happening to that meat? And the meat trade in general has been really hidden. One reason is that the fin trade, as we saw in the plenary, is very centralized. It comes through a few hubs around the world, and there can therefore be monitored genetically. It's much harder to do that with, I'm not sure why that slide's all over the place, but you can see it's a mess. And it's very hard to do this with the meat trade, because meat goes from places, many more places to many more other places. It also looks like this, so a bit like those yellow fins that we saw. Meat is just traded as meat. It's fresh or frozen. There isn't any species level identification. And so we were charged with trying to figure out where meat is going, who's landing it at the species level, and where is it being traded at the species level. And to figure that out, we started with this, which is piles of things in landings. And you can see that often these sorts of landing sites will be multi-species. How do we tackle this problem, right? We're trying to figure out who's trading what species of meat between countries, right? And it's all pretty much hidden. We started with FAO data because that is, people complain about FAO data, but it's actually important for 2 reasons. One is they work really hard to make the data as good as they can, but secondly, FAO data is data that's reported by a country that they take credit for. So there's a kind of ownership in the FAO data, because that's data that's submitted by a country to Rome, and various countries have said, we landed X tons of this species. But of course, they don't land it to the species level. Only about 29% of what gets reported to the FAO is at the species level. You can see the largest category here is just elasmobranchs, right? You get 48 or 40% are just elasmobranchs. And then you have this sort of taxonomic hierarchy of various taxonomic levels that get reported to the FAO data. The other problem with the FAO data is that not everybody participates. So certain countries choose not to, despite their sunny outlook. But as part of this project, my colleague Beth Babcock at the University of Miami decided to model what each country is probably missing in terms of reporting to FAO. So for example, in orange here, you can see some countries are really good with reporting. Spain, for example, this is a model estimate, is accurately reporting its landings to the species level. Whereas other countries like, for example, China, is not. So China only reports about 3% of its estimated landings according to us. So this is a bit of a headline. China got in trouble. China was called out 25 years ago for not underreporting landings, and they're still doing the same thing. When we look at the number of sharks landed, once we've done this sort of fancy decomposition statistically, we have a couple of estimates. One, because we have species-level information, if we just sort of take the average size of an animal, we can sort of back of the envelope calculate roughly how many individuals this is. And we calculate that at being roughly 100 million sharks are landed every year that end up in the meat trade. And this is sort of somewhat comfortingly a similar number to my colleague Boris Vorum at Dalhousie, who has used completely different methods to come up with the same number. However, really disconcertingly, when we do that same calculation for rays, what we get is about 191 million rays. And so what that means is that, yes, the shark problem is big, the ray problem, of course, is even bigger. And so this is landings. And then in terms of what ends up in the trade, about half of the sharks and less than half of the rays end up in the global meat trade. In terms of who's involved in these things, the major exporters are Spain, China, and the United States. But interestingly about the United States is that more than 50% of what the US exports as meat are rays, which is surprising to a lot of folks. There's a huge trade. What is it? A lot of it is these skates that are caught in New England, as well as some species out in Alaska. And trying to differentiate between skate species is really difficult. And so the U.S. tends to report, in terms of what is unreported to the species level, tends to be reported at these Ragidae and Ragiform type level. For importers, this is also shocking to some people, is that the biggest importer of elasmobranch meat in the world is South Korea. And it's almost entirely rays. And what's going on there? Well, what's happening is that this is just imports of species, the top 10 species imported into South Korea by exporter country. And what's happening basically is a hell of a lot of tonnage of meat is coming from Argentina and going to South Korea. Why is that happening? Well, it's happening because in South Korea, you may have been to Skate Street, which is being promoted as a gourmet tourist destination because culturally there's a street food in South Korea. I haven't had it, I haven't been to South Korea, where you can go and get this like delicacy that's in South Korea. So it's a very, very, very popular thing to eat. In terms of consumption, we have places like Indonesia and India and Mexico, who are the largest apparent consumers of elasmobranch meat. Apparent consumption being the sum of landings retained plus imports. And a lot of these are very culturally important. In Indonesia, it's very common to have, skewers or meatballs. In India, a lot of the meat is actually dried and salted and shipped away, which in our estimation is just left as apparent consumption. And then you have countries like Uruguay, where they actually act as a hub, where sharks are landed there, but then re-exported, in particular, to Brazil, where prisoners and children eat shark meat. In terms of what this means for the overall composition, I'll just highlight this over here, which is that pelagic sharks, we estimate, are still the most important sources of meat. That's not unexpected because that's what we've understood for a long time. But I think we're really highlighting is that skates as a group is the next most important group of what's traded for meat. And so again, this is sort of unexpected, is that the skates, rays, skates, are things that are very heavily exploited in the meat trade to a degree that we didn't really understand before. Now I'll just circle back to this happy photo to discuss the countries that are most involved in hiding species within the trade and within landings specifically. And there are a few players, actually. So more than 50% of the underreporting of species that happens to FAO happens just with 5 countries. And there they are: Nigeria, Japan, Indonesia, China, and Argentina. Okay? This hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, but I'm quite sure about this. And so what it means is that if we could get these countries to do better reporting of their species-level landings, then we would have a much more accurate picture globally. There's some really low-hanging fruit here. And at the species level, we have very specific targets that we can think about, which include short-tailed yellow-nosed skate. Now, this could be part of a complex in Argentina. There are other skate species that are being exported from Argentina to South Korea, but for the purposes of what we're talking about, those are probably being binned into this one very heavily exploited species. And there are other species involved here that have, are quite severe in terms of the lack of information about them, as well as their expected high volumes given the modeling we've put together. That's an overview. I'll just thank specifically the Shark Conservation Fund for funding this work, and of course our close collaborators, Dalhousie, Moat Marine Lab, WCS. Thanks everybody for your attention. So I'll kick myself off the stage because there's no time for questions. And I'd like to welcome Simone Niedermueller here, who's going to speak about decision-making and a tool she has for that.
So thank you very much. I invite you today to kind of explore together with me and the tool that I will be presenting if your country or your region is actually part of the big influencers in shark meat trade. So I'm presenting this work on behalf of a number of collaborators, the main author being Andres Ospina, who can't be here, and it's a collaboration between IMEDEA and WWF. So today, the tool, I need to look here because my eyes are not good anymore. I'm an old lady already, so apologies for turning away from you. So we went from 2021, where we published the very first report that focused fully on shark meat trade, because I work in the Mediterranean, and we realized quickly that in our region, we have some of the biggest importers and consumers of shark meat, and nobody was talking about shark meat. So as a conservationist, you know that sometimes it's important to really get out the work quickly when things are important and relevant, but it's also important to get your work through peer review. So in 2025, we published this work in Marine Policy. And over the years, we kept on updating the usability, but also the data. And so I would like to thank Sharks International that we are able to present these updates and present this tool that is actually freely available, that is reproducible. It's a living resource, so we really try to improve it. So please come to us for feedback. And it should be a collaborative thing. So try to think about how you can integrate it in your work, how you can integrate it in any platform to really scale the impact. So talking about trade value, and when you started to work on shark conservation, talking about shark fins was evident, everyone talked about it. But when you actually look at the figures, the value of shark meat is much larger, including also the value of ray meat trade. So some of the results quickly here. So Spain, #1 world shark trader. Imports and exports, very important. Then in terms of bilateral flows, you have the flows from Uruguay to Brazil, but shortly, closely to that bilateral trade, you actually have the trade from Portugal to Spain. And then rays actually, as also presented just by Aaron, Argentina dominates the export and South Korea the imports. So one of the outputs of the tools that we provide here is actually Sankey plots. So I personally love Sankey plots. I mean, I love them when you look at voter developments, but here for me, this is really a way how I like to think about things, and you can actually play with this on the tool. So here is the results for shark meat. So the EU is really an international redistribution center, and South America has the largest bilateral flows. So here is a result for the shark fins, no surprise here. The fin trade is centralized around Hong Kong and Singapore. And then here, key findings about ray meat trade. So interestingly, it came to us as a surprise that The US also has an important role, but also some of the European countries are really important if you look at the network and actually at some of the specific features of a network. So we use graph analysis to analyze the network. So graph analysis is a mathematical way to look into the connections within a network. It can be used for transportation, it can be used for social studies, and it was also used for cephalopods before we used it for sharks. And it has specific metrics, so the in degree, which actually tells you the number of distinct source countries. So it shows you the import diversity. The out degree, which is the number of destination countries, it shows you the export reach of that trader. The strength, which is maybe the one that people are more familiar with because it's the weight sum of imports and exports, so it's the overall trade importance of that trader. And the betweenness. So here, this is a metric that is really important because it shows you, is this a country a bottleneck? So what's the importance, what goes through that? And it can be really important when you look at where do you need to focus my work. And then same, the so-called eigenvector, which actually shows you if there is a really high connected trader to how many other high connected country this trader is linked to, and this is important for the systemic influence. How can I influence the entire network when just working on one trader? So policy implications, so what does it reveal? How can it actually provide some evidence that can be useful for the work that we are doing in the day-to-day? So you can rank the countries. You can actually look which export countries are important, so where do I focus for my CITES implementation, which are the most relevant countries. I can actually compare, is there a difference before and after some policies have been put into place. It can identify species and product combinations because UN Comtrade data that are being used has a lot of product categories. So this is one of the most important aspects of this commodity database. And you can share the dashboards, and we have done this also successfully with media after the launch. So the report had quite a good media resonance far beyond the region in media in the US. And you can download all the outputs for whatever else you want to use it for. Who is the app for? So it's for policy and trade managers, conservation practitioners, and research and scientists. The output that it provides you, and here's a QR code if you want to test it for yourself right now. So it's network maps, time series, Sankey diagrams, and summaries and download functions. So it is built with Python Shiny. And so I'm gonna try here. So this is a little video that shows you. So we have actually also started to put political country groups in one block. So if you just want to look at what trade is going on for the EU or what trade is going on for countries that are a party to specific regional seas convention, you can do that. You see here the time series. You can choose between value and price. You can play with the time series, like what are the years that I want to look at. Do I want to look at value? Do I want to look at mass? And as I said, all of this is downloadable and freely accessible. Here, my favorite, the Sankey plots, and here you can also play with how this Sankey plot looks. You can play with the bars and arrange it in a way that you find the most susceptible for other people. So just some recommendations that we included in some of the publications. So it can be used to expand and enforce CITES listings, just to underline that traceability really is the structural bottlenecks in those networks. We need science-based catch limits at RFMOs because trade is only the second step. The first step is the catch. And then really we need international coordination led by those trade hubs. This is really key, because working on some countries that don't play a big role in the network will only scratch the surface. Some key takeaways. So trade is really dominated by a small number and small group of nations. Spain alone is really the world's largest shark meat exporter and second largest importer, and the EU bloc is really, really important. It has a special responsibility here. Shark meat and ray meat exceeds shark fin trade. We have this open access app. Please let me underline, use it. I mean, reference it, of course, but it's really our interest that it's been used as widely as possible. And then coordinated international action is really important. Oops. No, it's not working. So I just wanted to show you this video, but it's not playing. Here. So this is the Mediterranean. It's sometimes really underestimated for the biodiversity we have. I want to thank all the authors. There's no donor here because we literally did this work with table scrap funds. So I like to really thank the individual donors that support WWF. So your families maybe, or your kids or whatever. So sometimes a little money can go a really long way. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Brilliantly on time. Anybody have a question for Simone? Yep.
Hi, I'd like to ask about the statistics of the trade. So basically, being in this conference so far, I've been hearing that they've been saying that Indonesia is the world's largest shark fishing nation, and a lot of Asia-Pacific nations apparently contribute a lot to the shark fishing landings. And I see that it's, according to your data, it's actually the EU and nations in the Americas that actually contribute a lot to the shark trade. So I was wondering if, especially coming after the plenary talk by Stan and Diego, if you could confirm that this disparity is due to lack of data collection from Asia-Pacific nations, and if so, what's your organization doing to resolve this lack of data collection in trade from Asia-Pacific countries? Thank you.
So the first answer here is really important to differentiate fishing and landings and then trade. So these are can be two different things. It can also be part of the trade, but if you have a lot of local consumption, this meat never shows up in international trade. Then you have the different commodities. So what I would directly do is to invite you to just try out the tool, like click on Indonesia, play around with the different commodities, and then it can give you a first indication where do you need to look deeper. And then, of course, there's really numerous projects going on. I would not be able to enumerate them by WWF and many, many other organizations in order to improve, actually, landing data, because there it really starts. If you don't have the granularity in the landing data, you will never have it later on in supply chain.
Great, thank you very much, Simone. All right, next up is Aaron Martins, who's going to be speaking to us about the global shark and ray meat market.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I will start my talk with the question, are there benefits in shark and ray meat consumption? Well, we know there are benefits in seafood consumption. So seafood represents about 17% of the animal protein intake globally. And if you look into more details on the numbers, we're talking about 3.3 billion people that rely on seafood for at least 20% of their daily protein intake. This number is much higher in coastal communities, with about 70% of people relying on seafood for more than 70% of their daily protein intake. And these are numbers that are likely to increase as seafood consumption has been increasing over time in a fast pace. So although a lot of us don't like to think of sharks and rays as seafood, in fact, they are. They play important roles in socio-economic and cultural aspects of coastal communities, including being a food source, and that has been happening since the beginning of civilization. So when we talk about shark and ray meat consumption, we generally see it through a couple of lenses. We obviously immediately think about overfishing. So if there is a piece of shark meat in someone's plate, that means there was an event of fishing that happened before. And we know very clearly and very obvious through this conference as well that illegal and unregulated fishing has led many shark and ray populations to decline. We often think as well through economics. We know that fisheries and trade are important activities for coastal communities. They provide a good source of income and they support livelihoods for many people. And we more recently have been talking as well about contamination. As we know, some species of sharks and rays, they do have bioaccumulants in their meat, both natural, such as mercury, but as well as absorbed from the environment. So recently, we've seen papers coming out with cocaine, antibiotics, caffeine, and all of these other components that can be a risk for the health of people that consume them. What we don't talk about very much is about nutrition. There are many people around the world that consume shark meat, so there must be some sort of benefits and reasons of why those people are relying on this as a food source. And in times of economic crisis and vulnerability to climate change, it's important that we consider these aspects of shark and ray meat as well, so we have a better understanding on how they contribute to nutritional values as well as how they contribute to nutrition of coastal communities. So the objectives of this study was to quantify the concentration of 6 nutrients that are essential to human health in shark and ray meat, and start shedding some light into the potential contribution of shark and ray meat to food security and nutritional diversity. So to do that, we collected samples from a couple of different countries around the world that we knew that would have certain level of consumption of shark and ray meat, and also where we had collaborated with laboratories that would help us analyze this data, the samples, sorry. So we collected samples in the US, Brazil, UK, France, and Australia. And what I'm gonna show you now are very, very, very preliminary findings. So I kindly ask you not to share this because we had some delays on the samples. We're still waiting for samples in the US, so these numbers may vary a little bit here and there, but the trend is kind of very clear at this point. So what we have here is what we call the required nutritional intake. So it's how much an adult human would need on a daily basis of given minerals. And we can see very clearly the sharks and rays for all the species that we sample provide a good source of selenium. Some species going up to 200% of the required daily intake. They are a decent source of protein, varying from 25 to 50% of the daily intake. And some species provide a good source of omega-3, but not all of them. When we combine all the sharks and rays that we sampled and compare to other food sources, I think that's when things get a bit more interesting. We can see again very clearly in the first 2 panels that they are good sources of selenium and omega-3, and that compares to sardines and salmon, for example, which we generally think it's a staple of healthy foods, and definitely higher than what you get from beef, pork, or chicken. For the other minerals, then they're not really good sources of nutrition. Like they provide really little zinc, iron, and calcium, and you would be much better eating probably sardines or beef if you're looking at addressing those deficiencies. And for protein, it's kind of the same, so could vary and pick and choose whatever of these food sources. The next step of our analysis is to have a look at the regional distribution of this nutrition profile for the species that we sampled. We already can see that there is some quite marked differences. So we're gonna be using the Sharkpedia data to look at biological traits and start to see if we can find some clear patterns in terms of the characteristics, the biological aspects of the species and the location that they were sampled, and the nutritional composition of the shark and ray meat. And we're also gonna be using the shark meat trait data, which Aaron just talked about, to start seeing how much of that shark meat actually plays a role in terms of livelihoods. So just with a couple of few examples here, we already can see that we're talking about, in a yearly basis, more than 400,000 meals that will be provided from that meat. And I know that everyone here wants sharks to be preserved and conserved, myself included, but those are important numbers that we need to consider when we're talking about decision making. So why do I think this is important? So sharks and rays are a relatively easy, accessible food source, and they have low market value. And in times of economic crisis, these are generally the type of food that low-income communities tend to rely on. And at this point in time, we don't have any indication of how much they actually rely and need this for their nutritional, to address their nutritional deficiencies. So in scenarios where you have a reduction in availability of shark meat, for example, through population declines, or management scenarios in which you have fish bans or fishing bans or reduction in quotas, for example, where you're going to have less shark and ray meat available, we don't know, in fact, how much that would affect coastal communities. And understanding this information is also a really important point, as that would help us also understand motivations for catch and consumption. And I personally believe that having all this information combined could be really important to help us tailor more strategic managed actions that would be more effective for coastal communities. So in terms of future directions for these projects, we are still waiting on some samples to be analyzed, but after that, we'll be developing a model of nutrients for all sharks and rays based on the model that has been developed for fish by Hicks in 2019. And in a very optimistic scenario, we would like to see this sort of information integrated into health, food, and fisheries policies, so we can hopefully address two aspects that I personally think are critical for shark and ray conservation, which are informed consumers. So with more information that we provide to consumers, they can make more informed decisions regarding consuming or not consuming shark meat. And if they decide to do so, they can make decisions based on maximizing their nutritional intake and reducing exposure to contaminants. And secondly, in terms of redirecting catch, we all want fisheries to be sustainable and be based on healthy stocks. So we could focus on high productivity and a broad nutritional benefit from that fisheries while we protect vulnerable species. So before I go, I just wanted to take the time to thank all the people that have helped me through this process. We still have a lot to do, and thank you all for being here. That's it.
Thank you very much, Anna. We're slightly behind time, but anybody have a very quick question? Yep.
Yes, here. Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you were checking the benefits risk balance also nutritionally, because so we've been doing a lot of bit of food security in artisanal fisheries in Central Africa, for example, and Elasmo branch rank always super bad compared to fish, etc. Because, for example, you presented super high selenium value, but that's completely countered by huge mercury and heavy metal concentration. So yes, it's always like they're bringing some nutrients, but it's always a bit...
Quick question.
Yes, sorry. I'm finishing there.
Yeah. No, totally agree with you. I would love to have run the samples together so we can look at the ratio of mercury and selenium. Is a funding situation. So I know there's a lot of research towards the risks. I wanted to have a bit of understanding on the benefits as well, so we can argue with people a bit better regarding, balancing what they're consuming. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. Okay, now we're going to have Chris Mull talk to us about fish.
Good morning, everyone. When we think about shark fin illegal trade, we usually think about those kinds of markets where all types of protected species are for sale. And indeed, as you can see, fins are still of high values in Eastern Asia. However, these fins were not exposed, but in the back room. The price was written by hand and the origin unspecified. In other words, these fins were probably smuggled one, and the scene you've just watched may be a case of criminal convergence. But let us leave Japan and go to the back room of the illegal trade itself, where things are usually even more hidden. Their journey conducted me to 5 countries: Sao Tome and Principe and Gabon in Central Africa, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Ecuador in Latin America. The goal was to study the dynamics of exploitation and conservation of sharks at conflict issues. And one of the key aspects of those conflicts is shark fin trade. So I chose to investigate it, and especially to focus on the illegal one. However, for that, we need specific tools. And as a political scientist and an international relations researcher, I had to look beyond my fields to find a suitable theoretical framework. That's how I came to criminology, which is interdisciplinary by nature and indeed includes political sciences. Criminology aims at analyzing the different types of crime from the socio-cultural perception and the legal regimes constructed against them, to the motivation underlying them and the psychological, sociological, and economic profile of the individuals or group committing these crimes. But criminology also studies the victims of crimes. And in this respect, green criminology then opened the area of research by recognizing the environment and its components as victims. Following Michael Lynch, green criminologists indeed focus on a wider variety of class-related injustices that poison the environment of all classes, peoples, and environment, and animals. Since the 2010s, green criminologists have produced lots of papers on illegal wildlife trade and wildlife crime. Yet, fish remain generally out of the scope. That's the second reason why I chose to study sharks from the green criminology perspective. As shark fin trade is global, I first used quantitative data to get a big picture of it. So I analyzed all the official data I could find about shark fin seizures in the world since 2019, with a view to identifying the hotspots of smuggling shark fins. So here you can see a map I realized in cooperation with the Conversation France, and this map highlights that 47% of global seizures of smuggling things between 2019 and 2025 came from the Eastern Pacific region. And 31% of them came from the Gulf of Guinea. However, a seizure is only a part of the picture. At best, customs size no more than 10% of all the illegal trade. And what's more, many authorities don't publish all the seizures they do. For instance, Sri Lankan administration officially cited about 2,200 fins, but in fact, the services cite much more, and they just couldn't publish everything they sized. We have the same trouble in France. So, figures not being that reliable, qualitative analysis is much needed. And my methodology is thus mainly qualitative, relying on semi-directed interviews and informal dialogues during my fieldworks. I spent 8 months alone in 5 countries, in the 5 countries I mentioned, and I did more than 180 interviews. Here in the room, I think there are some people I've interviewed during my fieldwork, so Godefroy, Yuri, Carlos Polo, Alex, Gabriel, thank you so much. Indeed, this research wouldn't exist without people like you that grant me their precious time and information. Thanks to my fieldworks, I could identify different patterns emerging depending on states and the regulations in force. And obviously, I will only give you global tendency today. So, in Costa Rica and Sao Tome and Principe, where shark fishing is allowed, shark smugglers are mainly corporate crime groups. Indeed, some company are using their illegal facade to facilitate the shipments of illegal goods. In Sao Tome and Principe, where shark fins are not allowed to be exported, they indeed smuggle them. However, in Costa Rica, where shark fins are illegally exported, these companies have smuggled drugs hidden in frozen shark bodies in cooperation with drug traffickers of Mexico. It is relevant to say that the Santomean smugglers themselves are also involved in drugs, which means that there is a crime convergence in both of these countries. In Colombia and Gabon, shark fishing is restricted to some communities and fins cannot be sold nor exported. Thus, for the local communities which are allowed to keep the shark they incidentally catch, it is shark meat which is really sought after. Despite the sharp decline in shark fin trafficking in these areas, there is still an illegal trade going on. The case of Colombia reveals a crime convergence as well, as two smuggled fins shipments sized since 2021 implied drug traffickers. However, in those two countries, the networks that were traditionally involved in shark fin smuggling have been able to compensate with the rise in swim bladder smuggling. This specific type of traffic is indeed very similar to the shark fin one, and it creates high opportunity for money laundering. So here in the picture, you can see a fresh swim bladder, which is in Gabon actually. And this one are just dried like shark fins, but their value is even more higher than shark fins. This one, when we have good quality ones, dried, it's $600 a kilo, in Costa Rica, in Ecuador, or in Gabon, whereas shark fins get that price when they are already in the Asian market. In this respect, Ecuador has become a crossroads for both sharks and the swim bladders smuggling. While swim bladders mainly come from Colombia, so the northern boundary of Ecuador, and go to Hong Kong, the shark products are mainly exported to Peru, so to the southern boundary. The country also stands out for a particular type of criminal symbiosis between some fishermen and drug traffickers. Ecuador officially prohibited fishing gears designed to target sharks, but they remain massively fished by many coastal communities for both their meat and fins. Actually, most of these catches are not accidental. The real stakes are elsewhere, in a meeting along the so-called desert road, and shark fishing has become a cover. Hence, after having delivered cocaine or fuel for the go-fast which convoy it, the fishermen involved didn't need to compensate for the days without any fishing activity. And that's why they tend to target sharks, especially when they are on their way back and they say they are sailing near the Galapagos Islands reserves, where all Selachimorpha are strictly protected. So, by highlighting the criminal convergence between shark trafficking and other illegal transnational activities, these studies underscore the pressure that drug trafficking is putting on sharks' population. They also put in relief the adaptability of the networks involved in these various illegal transnational activities and the need for systemic approach to tackle wildlife crime. Indeed, wildlife crime is not only an environmental crime, but also a threat to global security. In many cases, the relationship between the fishermen and drug traffickers evolves at the expense of the latter, particularly when the fishermen want to stop providing their services to drug traffickers. In Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, numerous fishermen have been killed by drug traffickers. In Costa Rica, cases of drug mules are increasing. The message I want to share with you now was shared with me by many Latin people. While some Asian countries remain the leading consumers of shark fins, Westerners are the leading consumers of cocaine. The drug is now everywhere, from series to shark bodies, as recent study demonstrated. What we consume is not only drugs, but thousands of shark lives and thousands of human lives. Drugs are not cool, they are blood. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you so much to my man, which has done so many kilometers to support me.
What a fantastic talk. Thank you very much for it. I'm going to ask that we speak with Alexandra at the coffee break, because tea is about to happen. Thank you very much. My pleasure to introduce Devanshi Kasana, who's going to talk to us about reporting of trade in the Mesoamerican region.
I know we're all jonesing for tea, but you gotta sell for me. I'll be quick. All right. We're gonna take a trip. Can you hear me? Okay. We're gonna take a trip down to Central America, more specifically Belize. Belize is a Mesoamerican nation with a well-managed small-scale shark fishery, and about a little less than 2/3 of all landed species in this fishery are listed on CITES, the convention that you've heard a lot about over the course of this week. And so you might say, well, you're saying it's well managed, so what's the big deal? Well, the Belize shark fishery exists because of its trade in shark meat with its neighboring nation, Guatemala, which happens to be a major consumer. And because of the international nature of this trade between Belize and Guatemala, Belize as a contracting party to CITES has an obligation to start reporting the trade. And this means that they now need to start issuing CITES export permits if they want to be compliant. I'm not sure if you caught Cass Rigby's talk earlier this week, but she gave a really good primer on what it means when a species gets listed on CITES. But in a nutshell, there are two key things that need to happen in order for a nation to be compliant. An NDF, or a non-detriment finding, which essentially ensures that the harvest of that species is sustainable and not detrimental to its survival. And if a positive NDF has been established and commercial trade can continue to happen, as long as the catch is in accordance with the legal framework of that exporting nation, an export permit will be issued. So Belize received, thankfully, a positive NDF for all those listed species that they were trading in. And so as long as the fisher had a shark fishing license, they were fishing in the area they were licensed for, and they were doing so during the open fishing season, they were compliant and they could get an export permit. But here's where things get a little bit trickier. Now, the CITES export permit reporting requirements are quite intensive, and they require species-specific trade data. And that continues to be a little bit of an issue, for a challenge for a lot of countries around the world, as we've heard about during the course of this week. Now, a little bit Belize-specific context. In 2015, the Belize Fisheries Department, started issuing these logbooks, which were supposed to record what species were being landed, how many of each species, and what the volumes or the weights of each of these species were. But historically, compliance was pretty low. And so in order to kind of counteract that, in 2023, as you can see in the picture in the middle, these weighing scales were installed in the fishing camps as a way of facilitating these data collection. And the second thing that I kind of want you to hold in your mind for a little bit, the second prerequisite for license renewal was that all the licensed fishers were expected to submit these secondary low-value fins in the third picture, specifically the anal fins, and we'll circle back to why that's important in just a second. And so, like I said, these export permits now mandate species-specific reporting by commodity. So whether it's fins, skin, meat, you now need to have this data. And there's two key things. There's two obvious issues that I see in terms of shark meat. So when sharks get filleted or dressed, which typically happens pretty early on in the supply chain, they lose their visual identification characteristics. So it's practically impossible to identify what species that came from. The second thing that happens in Belize is that once a shark is filleted, they get salted for preservation. And these salted fillets are then stored in these barrels on the at the fishing camps until they're ready to be exported. You could say that, hey, why not just separate the species in these barrels? And when that suggestion was offered by the Belize Fisheries Department, it was concluded that it was logistically infeasible and impractical to actually do that in the fishing camps. So we were at a bit of an impasse wherein Belize wants to be compliant and the fishers wanted to continue trading unrestricted. And so we wondered if there's a way to develop a protocol that uses a combination of the tools that were already available. The government issued logbooks, and the fishers submitted anal fins. And the idea was, is it possible to use these two things to collect species-specific catch and trade data? And so the first component of that protocol was, as you can see in the logbook, they're already expected to report the number of individuals landed by species. Luckily for us, Quinlan et al. Were able to visually identify what species an anal fin came from just by looking at it. And so we used that information to sort of cross-validate what was being reported in these logbooks by the fishers. So that was our first sort of system of checks and balances in place. The second part of that protocol was a little bit more involved, and we asked the question that if we knew the total weight of individual of species A that was landed, is it possible to build these conversion factors and extrapolate what the fresh fillet weight would be? So how much fresh fillet can be harvested from a 50-pound hammerhead shark? And then, because in Belize, they're salting it, remember? And so the exported product is actually the salted fillets. And so the second conversion was to be able to convert those fresh fillets into salted fillet weight per species. And what that looked like in terms of the protocol was we went to these fishing camps and started taking paired measurements. The first one being the live catch weight, or the total weight of an individual using the weighing scales in the fishing camps. Then we weighed every individual fillet that came out from that shark, tagged it, allowed it to be salted and stored, and re-weighed it as close to export as possible. So I'm not sure that you can, if you could imagine me floundering around a fishing camp trying to tag and weigh every fillet, in hindsight, it was actually quite funny. And I think the fishers were actually found it quite funny too. They were quite amused. And I think that is where a little bit of a switch happened, in the sense that something really meaningful happened. They became curious about the process. They asked questions about these conversion factors. They got invested in building them with us. And I think that sort of buy-in and ownership and co-creation of research is what truly resulted in this being successful at the end. And so after a lot of coding, crying, and the magician that is Beth Babcock, we put all these measurements into these linear mixed models, and were able to get species-specific conversion factors, which essentially means like every species had its own multiplier. And so what that would look like is, once a logbook was validated matching the anal fin counts with the number of individuals per species, you would take the reported weights that were actual measurements from fishing camps in that column C, and convert it using these conversion factors to then verify the export permits. So two things happened. Belize as a nation can now be compliant, and fishers can continue trading unrestricted. The final component of this was, beyond the trade data, we wanted to see also if we could establish species-specific relations between the anal fin length and the total length. So if you knew what the length of the anal fin was, could you estimate what the total length of that individual was? And we were able to do that. And why that's important is because it allowed us to assess the status of the fishery, doing things like length-based assessments, without the need for very extensive landings, surveying, which are obviously very resource intensive. And we also heard yesterday, I believe, about the importance of moving CITES data reporting further upstream to the catch bit of the supply chain, and I think this is a great way of supplementing that. And you can really see the success of this protocol starting to be reflected in the CITES trade database now, where you now have species-specific information for the supply chain between Belize and Guatemala being reported, so which is really cool to see. This is just to say that Belize has successfully now tracked both production and catch data since the inception of this protocol, and compliance has significantly improved since the pilot season. I think what I really want to end on is something that truly reflects the heart of this project, and something that Barbara said in her keynote really resonated with me, and she said, we are facilitators, and I see this project being an example of us as researchers being facilitators. None of this would have been possible without the collaboration between the fishing communities, the resource managers, with us facilitating the process and really allowing them to take ownership of this. And this was built on a foundation of trust, and that was only possible because we engaged everyone early enough. We were transparent about everything that was happening, and there's always room for coming back to the drawing board and negotiating and iterating if something's not working. I will especially, I know we're out of time, I just want to really thank the shark fishing community of Riversdale of Belize, because this truly is their child. Like, thank you. I'll find me at tea, and I will answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Devanshi. And what a great theme. I think that's really the theme of this conference so far, is about engagement and trust.
Who's going to be talking about the European shark meat trade. Welcome, Joseph.
Never had walk-on music before. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Josef Amin, and I'm going to be presenting some of my research that I started during my undergraduate studies and have continued on since on the European shark meat trade. So, when I speak to the general public about meat, or shark trade, sorry, people often talk to me about fins. And that's true, but the shark meat trade is a far greater trade by both value and volume, as we've heard this morning. And we also know that Europe is a huge international trade hub. Alongside this, people are also quite surprised to hear that Europe has significant local consumption. And I'm not surprised by their surprise, because really, when you go to a fish market in Europe, you might not know that you're actually buying shark. And that's because of commercial designations. Now, EU labeling legislation is some of the best in the world. However, it does have its drawbacks. Each country is required to publish a national list of labels and their corresponding species. But these can include lots of local vernacular names, and also one label can correspond to multiple species. This leads ultimately to consumer confusion, and morphological identification can be really hard with these processed samples. Therefore, it's essential that we monitor the trade at the consumer level. Now, traditionally, this is done using DNA barcoding studies, and these are fantastic. Lots of studies have come out of Europe that have looked at threatened species and mislabeling. However, single country analyses limit our ability to draw broader continental scale conclusions. And so we set out to do exactly that. We compiled the largest collection of DNA barcode samples from shark meat in Europe, and we leveraged a fantastic network of citizen science collaborators to collect these samples and retailer information, label information from across 10 countries. We then combined this with over 500 samples from the published literature, and this enabled us to get a far greater sort of data set. To identify the novel samples, we used a multiplex primer cocktail. I love saying that. Thanks to Diego and his team for developing this, we were able to amplify the whole CO1 gene along with 2 mini barcodes at either end. And the mini barcodes are really important for these degraded meat samples because it gives us greater coverage. So to investigate the trade, we looked at 3 key sort of themes. The first were, what patterns of species did we see on sale? Next, we looked at the patterns of threatened species on sale, where were they found? And finally, was there any mislabeling? So, what did we find? Well, across 794 samples from our novel samples and meta-analysis, we found 31 species. The most common was the blue shark, followed by the spiny dogfish when it comes. And then finally, the small spotted cat shark. And when we start to split up our samples by country, we find significant differences in species compositions. I want to pick out a few key patterns here. So first of all, let's look at our most common species. This is the blue shark. And you can see that consumption is really mostly centered in southern European and Mediterranean countries. And this is largely due to potentially a large pelagic longline fleet and also significant importation into these countries. Interestingly, the vast proportion of our spiny dogfish, the shy one, was found in the UK, and this is potentially due to the UK's strong traditional consumption habits with fish and chips, as Chris sort of talked about earlier. Now, Squalosacanthius is also popular in Germany, where it's sold as a really unusual product called Schillerlocken, and this is the smoked belly flaps of the shark. Finally, we see fairly considerable sales of smoothhounds in UK, France, and Netherlands, but the vast majority we see in Italy and Greece, linked to traditional dishes like palombo and spinarollo and Gallia scordalia in Greece. We then looked at threatened species, and we found them on sale in every country. Over 40% of the samples in our data set were from threatened species. There were differing proportions between countries, and I'll pick out just two examples here. So in France, we had relatively low proportions of threatened species, driven by small spotted cat sharks, which are least concern, and near-threatened starry smoothhounds. On the other end of the scale, the Netherlands had a really high proportion of critically endangered species. It was only 21 samples, the total sample size, but this came from the tope shark. And similar to our countries, we also found threatened species in every retailer, with differing proportions across different retailer types. Now, restaurants and takeaways had a high proportion, and that's because we sampled a lot of restaurants and takeaways in the UK, and we know the UK loves spiny dogfish. The supermarkets on the under end of the scale had relatively low proportions to the other retailers, and this is probably driven by the fact that these are large corporations that are under larger scrutiny and sort of regulation. Now, going back to our species list, we found 7 CITES listed species. We didn't include the most recent additions or the ones to come because we collected the samples before these were listed. However, it's really important to bear that in mind as we go forward. How will the market and the trade respond? Because a lot of our species in the samples will be listed on CITES. So moving on to mislabeling, we defined mislabeling as a shark product whose DNA barcode or label, a shark product whose DNA barcode did not correspond to the label or commercial designation it was given. Mislabeling rates were significantly different across countries. Generally, we see that Southern Europe has higher mislabeling rates, with Italy having over half of all the samples we analysed being mislabeled. Now, when we look at retailers, we also find significant differences, with restaurants and takeaways having the lowest and fish markets and fishmongers having the highest. Restaurants and takeaways have the lowest, but for different reasons. Restaurants and takeaways and supermarkets have the lowest, but for different reasons. Now, restaurants and takeaways are governed by slightly different legislation, which is more relaxed, and that means that they have lower mislabeling rates. On the other hand, supermarkets are probably more regulated, and therefore they have lower mislabeling rates as well. So there's lots of different reasons for mislabeling. We've also got accidental reasons, so morphological identification can be hard. Fishmongers and fish markets often use traditional names because that's what people are accustomed to hearing. There's the economic incentive for mislabeling, so some products were mislabeled because they were going to gain more at market. And finally, label specificity, and this is really, really important. When we think about commercial designations, we can have a lot of umbrella terms, and these undermine consumer choices. So the mislabeling rates that we see might not actually be a product of fraud, but rather the product of the mislabeling rate. Rather a product of the legislation. So to conclude, we found that different countries have different species preferences, and this is driven by a number of factors, including traditional dishes, economic factors, and species distributions. Threatened species were found on sale in every country, and a high proportion of our sort of most popular products were from threatened species. And finally, labeling practices seriously undermine consumer choice. With demand for sustainable seafood growing and awareness of the issues affecting our seas and sharks, it's really important that the sector provides more accurate and informative labeling to enable step change. and to reduce the number of species of conservation concern in our markets. And with that, I'd just like to thank my supervisors, Andrew and Chrissa, the huge network of citizen science collaborators across Europe, and obviously Blue Resources Trust and Sharks International for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joseph. Do we have questions? Questions for Joseph? Right there. Holly. Can we get... Oh, thank you.
Hello. Hi, Joseph. Thanks. Hello. That was a great presentation. I'm just kind of interested, so in the end, your conclusion was, I guess, different countries prefer different species. And I'm wondering whether it's, is it really preference when most consumers don't actually really know, A, that they're consuming shark, and B, what species of shark it is. And so I guess I just think there's something interesting there in terms of, I guess that's the apparent consumption, but how do we, I guess, better inform consumers to let them know that what they're actually consuming is shark, and then maybe they might not have a preference for it.
That's true, yeah. It's quite, sort of, there's a juxtaposition of two different things going on there. So I think certain countries have very broad legislation. So the UK, one label can correspond to 50 different species. But we're still seeing the sort of same labels pop up. So there is this, and generally the same species pop up within those labels. Whereas places like Italy have really specific labels. So there is this sort of point about the importance of making the labels sort of more narrow. But I think one thing we're really interested in is actually giving the consumer more information by providing like a sort of threatened status on the label. Like an IUCN listing or something like that, to make it like a red, amber, green sort of scale of threatened species.
All right. Thank you, Joseph. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker. We're going to swim on over to India, and Divya is going to talk about the scale and the nuances of chondrichthyan meat consumption in India. Welcome, Divya.
Hi, everyone. I got really inspired by today's plenary session and then decided that in any case, there's a bunch of us who've been working together who are all talking in the session. And so maybe we should just treat it like a team talk, except that we're not going to be in parallel, we're going to be in series. And so essentially what I'm doing now is giving you the introduction. And I have a whole 10 minutes for that now. While Nidhi and Chatuki will be following with different studies that we've done, not just in India, but also in Sri Lanka. And then we have Claire in the afternoon who will be talking specifically about some of the work in Sri Lanka. Okay, so I sort of came to studying shark and ray meat consumption because I was setting up this sustainable seafood initiative in India called In Season Fish. And we were really inspired by work done by World Fish and so on, looking at the diversity of seafood being eaten and the nutritional value and livelihoods and so on. And as part of that, we noticed that in local markets, in addition to the sort of top favorite fish that people were eating, we were also seeing a lot of these relatively more unusual fish like sharks and rays and guitar fish in this case. We then started looking at this in a little more detail. We started digging into social media to understand what people were thinking about sharks and rays in India. And we looked at the captions that people were putting along with their social media pictures of sharks and rays and found that the majority of people were talking about sharks and rays in the context of consumption. They were pretty much posting about eating sharks and rays. So it did seem like that was a big problem. There were studies by other researchers as well, looking at consumption across India. And they found that it was quite widespread in coastal areas. People were sort of preferring to eat different types of species. So for instance, there was preference for small-bodied sharks on some parts of the east and west coast, while rays and large-bodied sharks were preferred more towards the south. And they were able to see these differences, but their overall conclusion was that it was a relatively small proportion of the population that were eating these species. But a small proportion of the population is a relative term. We are in India, which is the most populous country in the world, and a small proportion of our population could be the population of an entire country. So that's still a big deal. And so we felt like rather than focusing on the number of people eating it, we should maybe look a little more at what was driving people to eat this. And so we decided to then look at shark and ray meat consumption across all the coastal states of India as well as in Sri Lanka, and to sort of understand how important consumption was to the people who are eating it, and to understand why people were eating it. We started this off with a study of the trade. And you can see here my colleagues Shruti and Sudha Kotilil, and a really bored trader who's waiting for us to finish looking at whatever he's selling. And as what we essentially found that was that unlike some of these Western markets, a lot of the sharks and rays here are being sold whole, so people can see exactly what they're eating, and they're still choosing to eat it. And a lot of the products that were really important to the fishers and the local traders were different kinds of meat products. So they were either fresh or dried or salted and so on. But a lot of them were talking about how this meat was really important, and that was the reason they continued landing sharks and rays. So we wanted to look at this in more detail, and then the pandemic hit. And we were wondering how we could do that. And then we thought about all the online platforms that had suddenly sprung up, which had started listing restaurants on their databases. So things like Deliveroo and Uber Eats and the Indian versions of that, which are Swiggy and Zomato and so on, had all this wonderful database of menus on them, where we started looking through those menus and identifying the restaurants that were selling seafood, which was 2,649 restaurants, and then went deeper into that and started looking at which of those were selling shark and ray meat. Once we identified those restaurants, we interviewed the people who were managing the restaurants to try and ask what they knew about the shark and ray meat that they were selling, and identified that broadly they didn't know very much, but they were able to tell us somewhat about the preferences. Firstly, that it seemed like consumers were asking for sharks rather than rays in restaurants. And that a lot of consumers were asking for small-bodied sharks rather than large-bodied sharks in restaurants. We also found regional hotspots like Goa and Tamil Nadu and tried to quantify how many sharks were actually part of this restaurant trade. And we found that it constituted about 10% of the small-bodied shark landings, which meant that 90% was going somewhere else. And as we heard from Aaron's talk in the morning, it does seem like a lot of India's landings of sharks and rays stay within the country and therefore must be consumed elsewhere. And that's why we felt like we really needed to understand what was happening at the household level rather than staying with the restaurants. Therefore, we decided to focus a lot on decision-making and the motivations of consumers, and wanted to use this technique that was developed from psychology and behavioral economics, and people like Holly have applied to shark fins, but this time use it to look at shark meat. So this is what Claire will be talking about in the afternoon, where basically we use these discrete choice experiments to give people options, whether they wanted to choose shark or ray, different kinds of price ranges, different levels of availability or ease of access, and different quality of meat. And we did this research in the two southern states of India, Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and in Sri Lanka, and she will tell you more. And then Nidhi, who's coming up next, did a similar thing, but slightly more upgraded in West Bengal and soon to be in Odisha. And similar to what Anna was saying in the morning, all of this information is now being fed back into the conservation work we're doing as part of In-Season Fish, which is the Sustainable Seafood Initiative. Because through that work, we were able to identify different target groups of consumers who react to different kinds of messages. So there were some people who were really concerned about health and eating the shark and ray meat for health. And for those people, we were able to target specific conservation messages about health and talk to them about other alternatives like tuna, for instance, which is not commonly eaten in India. Whereas others responded very positively to the more environmental conservation messages. And for those people, we were able to talk about, the amazing world of sharks and all of that stuff, and that seemed to resonate better. So overall, we were able to kind of translate some of this research to action. And all of this was made possible by the fact that we had such an amazing fishing and trading community that were putting up with us. But to find out more, please check out In-Season Fish and feel free to contact me later. Thanks to all the funders as well.
All right, thank you, Divya. In the interest of keeping on schedule, I request that you catch Divya at lunchtime. And I'm gonna cue the next speaker who's coming on stage, Nidhi Johari, who's gonna...
Hello, everybody. I'm Shatuki, and it's really great to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a project I did in my master's at Oxford. Now I'm actually probably the furthest away you could get from Oxford. I'm now in University of Sydney doing my PhD, but this work is really close to my heart because I got to do it at home as well as in collaboration with BRT. So not to preach to the choir here, but we know that sharks and rays are highly threatened with extinction, and overfishing being a leading driver of this. And as we've been hearing in this session today, the value of elastomeric meat trade has surpassed the shark fin trade by $1.1 billion. And there's been an increased prevalence of the consumption of elastomeric meat trade in a variety of countries, including India, Sri Lanka, which I'm going to be talking about today. So Sri Lanka is home to around 100 species of sharks and ray. And a report that was conducted in 2013 found that 60% of the national shark catch ends up in two main harbors, one in Beruwala and one in Negombo. So if you travel around 35 kilometers north of here, you will end up in Negombo. And I know around 60 of you were actually lucky enough to go visit this fisheries landing harbor that I did most of my study as well. So yes, as I said, Negombo is a prominent fishing city. There is also 3 main fish markets that I conducted my studies in my surveys, and 2 of these are actually right adjacent to the landing sites. It's also a tourist hotspot, so it's really close to the Bandaranaike International Airport, so we see a lot of tourists stopping over to spend a couple of days in Negombo, which is going to help with one of my objectives, which I'll get onto. So for this study, I planned my objectives to fall at different points of the supply chain. And of course, supply chain studies are really valuable, especially for small studies like these, because it can really help us identify where we can target certain types of interventions. So for objective 1, I used data from BRT that have been collected from 2017 onwards to really see what the profile of elastomeric banks that have been landed here. And then objective 2 is where I went in and collected information and did interviews with vendors and traders to really see what the market dynamics are in Negombo. And finally, for objective 3, I went and looked at the restaurant industry in Negombo. So of course I was inspired by Divya's study here, and I wanted to see whether there were some similar patterns occurring in Sri Lanka and in Negombo specifically. And with this slide here, it's a little bit complex, but I wanted to show that even though we're talking about just one city in the west coast of Sri Lanka, the supply chain is, of course, quite complex. And from my study, I only kind of looked at these two landing sites, these markets, and restaurant consumption. But of course, we'll be hearing from Claire about household consumption after lunch. And again, there are a lot of drying complexes, distribution of elastomer brand meat from Negombo onwards, and a lot of, for example, the role of women in these drying complexes as well. So my study is really a small proportion of this wider complex supply chain. So for an overview of the results, I found from the BRT data, we had a lot more data from the larger landing site compared to the smaller one over there, which only had 30 observations. And for my interviews, I conducted a total of 74 interviews at the 3 different markets and a bit of a bigger proportion of fresh fish vendors compared to dry fish vendors. This has a little bit of implication on different species identifications from the vendors because, of course, at the dry fish level, it is a bit harder to identify the different species. And I conducted a total of 78 total restaurant interviews in Negombo. So to start with the results, this is just to show you what the types of species I was finding at the landing sites. Again, repeated pattern from what we've been talking about is a lot of silky sharks and blue sharks were some of the most common, and actually 76% of species at the landing sites were shark compared to only 24 being rays. For this diagram, I looked at the different family compositions of elastomer brand at the 3 different points of the supply chain that I looked at. Again, there are some nuances to this because the vendor and the restaurant data here are dependent on just species counts that I asked the vendors on what they kind of deal with. Again, you know, there's vernacular names, there's Tamil and Sinhalese languages also spoken in Sri Lanka, so yeah. But then the most interesting finding from this is actually at the market level, the vendors were recalling more of the ray species than they were sharks, whereas at the restaurants, it was solely just shark being sold. I also did an interesting analysis called cultural salience analysis, where I also asked the vendors to generate a list of species that they sold the most or that they traded or dealt with the most. And I gave more value to species that were being kind of quoted more, like higher frequency, but also the ones that were higher up on that list. And from that modular, essentially more ray species were coming out from overall, but also the third, we have milk shark. And again, for milk shark, there's again a lot of complications in terms of how people identify milk shark. And speaking to other Sri Lankan researchers, it's also different depending on where you are in Sri Lanka and who you're asking as well. Again, this is really interesting from Nidhi's work as well, because I found that taste and health reasons were also one of the main contributors for why the vendors thought that people were eating shark. Health reasons specifically were tied to this belief that milk shark is really good for pregnant mothers, specifically lactating mothers. Of course, this kind of brings up a whole sort of array of things about misinformation, and of course we know that there's a lot of bioaccumulation of mercury and other sort of materials that we've heard from just this morning as well. And finally, when we're thinking about the restaurants, I only found 18% of restaurants that were actively selling shark, and none were selling ray. Again, quite similar to, well, the lack of kind of demand about shark was similar to what Divya found in India. And actually, there was no local demand in restaurants for shark, so it wasn't kind of common for, at least in Negombo, for local domestic Sri Lankans to go to these restaurants and to request for shark. So restaurateurs would tell me that it's kind of a risk to introduce shark if it's not like a commonality for people to come and order it. And none of the kind of popular dishes that were quoted by these restaurateurs included shark or ray either. So that's some good news. And finally, for my conclusions, so sharks are landed in really high volumes in the landing sites, but actually rays appear to be more quoted and salient in the markets. Taste and health are driving factors in domestic demand. And finally, there's little restaurant demand for sharks, and this is mostly targeted towards the more tourist-oriented restaurants. For future directions, Of course, there are research needs that, again, we'll hear about from Claire about this. We need to kind of talk to the consumers themselves, as we've seen that it's a domestic kind of consumption that's driving a lot of this. And other tourist hotspots all in and around Sri Lanka has also need to be investigated. So this is a restaurant menu that I came across when I was traveling in Jaffna just a couple of weeks ago, which is in the north of Sri Lanka. It was interesting to spot this regional dish, shark fish variety, that was listed. So again, there are these gaps that need to be filled. In terms of future policy needs, we of course need further legislation to protect shark and ray. As we know, there is only a few species of shark that are protected under Sri Lankan law. And misinformed health reasons also need to be brought to light, and we of course need to think about how we can do this in the best way, especially when it's linked to cultural identity and cultural views. I also wanted to shout out a little bit of my PhD research right now, which is conducted with Professor Joshua Sinner at the University of Sydney, where I'm kind of still looking at small-scale fisheries, supply chains, but actually thinking about it in a more of a network perspective, also thinking about social relations between traders, vendors, and fishers, and what that means for the sustainability of the whole system. So if this is of interest to you, please come and chat to me. Yeah, these are my references, and I'd like to thank my supervisors, which amazingly 3 of them are in this conference, which doesn't really happen when I present this work. And of course, Blue Resources Trust, my old team, and for Flying Sharks for funding a little bit of my trip here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakti. All right, well, we are at time, so we're going to move on to our next speaker, Rupasinghe, who's going to talk about mini-barcoding, specifically for the Sri Lankan dry fish industry.
Good afternoon, all. I warmly welcome you all here to Sri Lanka. And I'm Apsara Rupasinghe from Blue Resources Trust, and I'm doing my MPhil at the Wayamba University of Sri Lanka. Today, I will be presenting a part of my project, which is on applying DNA mini-barcoding to reveal the shark species diversity in Sri Lankan dry fish industry. So let's move on to the quick overview of the dry fish industry. Going back to the history, dry fish has been produced for centuries in Sri Lanka, with the first record of its trade appearing during the colonial period. Similar to the fresh fish industry, dry fish also plays a major role in Sri Lankan economic and social lives as an animal protein source. And also, it helps to reduce the post-harvest loss of the fresh fish, and it considered as the value-added product of the fresh fish. Main consumption of the dry fish can be seen in the low-income household, rural areas, dry zone, and the hill country because of its reasonable price and availability when compared to other animal protein sources. Primarily, dry fish is consumed as a main dish as well as a condiment to enhance the flavor of many veggie curries. Mainly, marine dry fish is produced along the coastal belt of the Sri Lanka, and 14% of the harvested fresh fish is produced as the dry fish, and contributing 65% of them to the national demand of the dry fish. Rest is being imported. Let's move on to the process which making the dry fish. So the first stage of processing dry fish is chopping into small pieces if it is a large fish. But if it is a small fish, like sprats, sardinella, juveniles of shark species are dried as the whole fish. So in the second step, you can see here, salt is added into the dry fish, and all the dry fish are put into the basket and leaving for 2 to 3 days. Then after that, the salted dry fish is washed and leaving for the sun drying for 3 to 4 days before the selling. So what is the problem identification? Once fresh fish dried and salted, their morphological characters are lost, which morphological characters are sold. So we can't identify the species using their morphological characters. And at the same time, DNA becomes highly degraded during the processing. Because of that, the amplification of standard cytochrome oxidase 1 gene region, we are calling as the DNA barcoding of 650 base pair DNA region is difficult. So therefore, I am applying DNA mini-barcoding to identify the shark species in Sri Lankan dry fish industry. And also other thing, here you can see how the shark dry meat is being sold in the public market. And when coming to the methodology, dry meat samples from public market were collected from 4 areas in the Sri Lanka, so which are located in the west, northwest, and the southern part, where the dry fish processing happens widely. And before the DNA extraction, samples were soaked in the nucleus-free water and incubated at the 40 Celsius for 2 hours to reduce the salt level. So after that, using a commercially available kit, DNA was extracted. When going to the PCR amplification, 2 primer combinations have used with 2 shark-specific reverse primers, and with the clean intensity band, the samples with the clean intensity band was subjected to the Sanger sequencing. And after the sequencing, both NCBI and BOL database are used to identify and confirm the species. So these are some gel images for the several species amplified using the both primer combinations. And this is the maximum likelihood which have reconstructed for the identified species, and pairwise distance also calculated to support this tree. And here you can see the clear separation of the species based on their species with the strong bootstrap value. And also this results highlights the reliability of the DNA mini-barcoding tool to identify the species level. When coming to the species composition, out of 40 samples, 30 samples have amplified successfully and identified the species. You can see here the silky shark shows the highest abundance among the other species, and also the scallop hammerhead shark shows the second highest number of within the recorded species. In addition to that, here there are 9 CITES listed species in the recorded species, 1 in CITES 1 and rest is in the CITES 2 appendix. And the important finding was here is the identifying the oceanic white-tip shark, which is nationally protected in Sri Lanka. And when considering their IUCN conservation status, you can see here the totally 80% of the recorded species are in priority status. So here 2 species are in critically endangered species and 2 other species are in the endangered species, and other thing is 40% of the species are in the vulnerable status. So coming to the conclusion, so here mini-barcoding tool successfully amplified the DNA degraded, successfully amplified the degraded DNA from the salted dried fish. And we can conclude that this is the reliable for the species identification. And other important thing is, out of 30, in the 30 samples, I can identify the 10 species. So we can conclude that the high species diversity can be hidden in the dry fish industry as a dry form. So to get the exact idea of the composition of the shark species, we have to expand the number of sampling location, and we have to expand the number of samples across the Sri Lanka. And finally, number of samples across the Sri Lanka. And this is my main, so I have done this as the pilot study, as the first stage. So this is my main findings so far. So I'm planning to continue this for the rest of the locations. And thank you all for listening. And I would like to thank all my funders, and especially for the CFAS for funding my project. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our next speaker. We're going to move on to our next speaker now. All the way from Indonesia, please join me in welcoming Linda, who's going to take us to the Java Islands.
Okay. Afternoon, everyone. How's good? It is great to be here at Shark International 2026. My name is Linda from Rekam Nusantara Foundation, Indonesia. Today, I want to bring your attention to the side of the sharks market that's often hard to look from the outside, which is the consumption behavior across Java's Indonesia, and when the sharks consumption stays at home and ends up on someone's plate. Okay, so there are 3 reasons why this matters. First, scale. The significant amount portion of shark's meat never reached the export market. It was consumed domestically and largely invisible in those trade statistics. Second, the species involved. What people are consuming are species that are listed as vulnerable, endangered, and even critically endangered species that has sold openly, unlabeled, and less is indistinguishable with less threatened species in the market. And the third is the missing piece of demand side data. So we know that regulation about the side of the supply chain is already exists, but without understanding who is consuming, how often, and why, those regulations are working in the dark. So, to understand better behind the bite, we conducted a field work across 18 cities in Java's island in 2024, and our approach combined consumer interviews, retailer surveys, and direct market observation with 197 consumers interviewed in total. And the geographic spread was intentional. We want to know what happened and what is the variation of different coastal communities across Indonesia's most densely populated island, Java. Okay, so this map shows the average of daily consumption in the city that we have surveyed. And to estimate that, we combine information between collectors, processors, and also retailers. For collectors, they provide the information on how much the shark's meat that they have purchased. And for the processor, they report the receive and loss during the process. And for the retailers, they report the sales record that to determine on how much the shark's meat reach the consumption and to the consumers. And as a result, Tegal stands out significantly, followed by Pemalang in Central Java, and those number was set to a next question that we have to deep dive again, because this number, because this didn't happen overnight, right? So what is the main reason driving the consumption in there, and when did it start? So when we look at how long people consuming sharks and ray meat, our respondent shows that 50% of them eating sharks and ray for more than half of their lifetime. And most started at the young age, between the age of 10 and 15. And this means it is not a habit people develop as an adult, but rather it was passed to them intergenerationally. And what sustains this at scale is demand. Java's demand is not small. As one of the home for more than over half of country's population, the household need for affordable protein here is huge. So it is that demand that over time sustain that and establish and shape trade network and strong distribution in the Java that we see today. Okay, so when we step back and look at the big picture, in Java, people don't eat shark because they just want to. People eat sharks because sharks are cheap. And it was confirmed by our 93% respondent that shows that they are eating sharks and ray meat because of for daily meals, and 48% of them shows that affordability is the main reason. And when we look at the price comparison, it tells you exactly why, because shark's meat sit at the price of $1.04 US, and it is cheaper than eggs, it is cheaper than chicken, and it is cheaper than some of other option seafood that they have. And it can be sold in a small portion, making for a family with a limited budget, it was not a coincidence. It is a decision that they have made. And yeah, so in Java, sharks and ray meat, it is affordable, it is accessible, and it is available. But affordability is not the only part of the story. Some of the people also tells that they consume sharks and ray because of the habit. And that two factors that keep reinforcing each other. So economics keeps it accessible and habit keeps it familiar. And that two together make one of the hardest consumption behavior to change and shift. So yeah, we know that price is the main driver that consumption of shark and ray meat in Java, but it doesn't determine of what ends up in everyone's plate. This is where the local context takes over. So in West Java and Jakarta, supply is comparatively lower and access to fresh seafood is takes longer time. So consumer in West Java and Jakarta prefer the sharks product that can last a little bit longer. So salted sharks deliver exactly that need. And in contrast, in Central Java and East Java, there is no need for a longer shelf-life product. So the smoked shark become a natural preference because smoked shark is easy to process and ready to eat. Okay, so we know that people in Java are consuming sharks and ray meat, but the consumers usually don't know what exactly that they are eating. To them, it is just sharks and rays. And to understand that better, using a DNA barcoding, we identified the families and the species that actually present. In northern Java, the shallow continental shelf and sandy muddy seabed favors families such as Glaucostegidae, Rhinidae, and Daciatidae families. But in contrast, in South Java's coastal, the deeper ocean support pelagic fisheries that present Carcharinid family and Spirnidae family. And among the product that we have tested, we found at least 7 critically endangered species that actually present. Okay, so we have to acknowledge that Java's consumption system was not built on sustainability. It was built on affordability and availability. And changing a behavior means reshaping a system that's never designed with a conservation in mind. So I think we can agree that public awareness is important work to do, but other than that, the species labeling plays a critical role in here too, because when people don't really know what they are eating and people really don't know what they are consuming, the awareness means nothing. So species labeling, with species labeling, we gave them option to choose whether to buy it or not. And without the species labeling, the option was never exist in the first place. And for the third recommendation, we have to be honest, the shark's meat is already one of the cheapest protein in our market that has available. So to answer that, we need a strong collaboration between government researchers and also strong support from local community to answer. So yeah, I think that is the story that I want to share about understanding consumption behavior in Java Island, Indonesia. Thank you for having me and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Linda. We're going to move on to our next talk. Our next speaker is also from Indonesia. Please join me in welcoming Irianies.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Irianies, and here I'm going to talk about the social-ecological drivers of small branch meat utilization in Banyuwangi, Indonesia. If you see the previous presentation, it's about the whole Java, it's the part of the Java Island. So Indonesia is a part of coral triangle. It's like mostly like over 14% of the shark species can be found in these Indonesian waters. We also have like 55 jurisdiction of ISRA. Unfortunately, we also have like a fisheries activities for sharks and ray across Indonesian waters, because Indonesia also known as a maritime country. So many people are really depend on this fisheries activity. So although fisheries are highly interconnected with the social-ecological system, we use this system to prove highly effective in comprehending the intricate interplay between the social and ecological dynamics in the utilization of the sharks and ray. So this study aimed to identify the utilization to provide the baseline understanding of the scale and the natures of the small branch exploitation using the social-ecological action situation framework by Schulter 2019. We try to understand and model the complex interaction between people and small branch to helping design conservation strategies that are both ecologically effective and social feasible. So our location is in Muncar. It's really near with the Bali Islands. So yeah, in Muncar there is targeted fisheries and also the bycatch fisheries activities. And for the methodology, we use the framework as also the analysis tool. There is 3 levels on there. There is a level 1, 2, and 3, plus causal loop diagram to enhance the analysis level 2. As a result, this study found that 12 entities from actors and the ecology, that is 9 actors entities, and we deep dive more with the interview and also the forum group discussion to deep dive more to understanding the utilization sharks and ray in Banyuwangi area. And the ecological things, we do some doing the biological things. And this is the level 2, the merge of causal loop diagram that we found. The utilization in Muncar is elasmo branch and consumer and become the most important loop of this utilization. Okay, next we move to the social. The primary factor is, of course, about the trading. The tradings, of course, happen because the fisheries until the consumer, and the rest of interaction happen because the trade. This is while happen competing and making the needs of rulemaking, coordination, deliberating, and information sharing to regulate and making the social interaction in a good way. And the trading is happen to all of the elasmo brands that found and landing in Muncar. This is the price for the raw meat that we get the data from the fishmongers. So the fishmonger is really powerful in the price for the sharks and ray. So the fishmonger in Muncar will buy the full body of the sharks determined by the fin size and with weight for the ray. Unless for the whale shark. So from all of the sharks that landing in Muncar and fishing in this Bali Strait area, there is one of the species that will never be fished by the fishermen, because in the local scale, they believe catching a whale shark is bring misfortune, and also the fishers in Muncar calling the whale shark is a grandpa shark. So now we know who is our grandpa shark. So for the socio-ecological, this characterized by the interconnected dependency among the local fisheries actors who typically use the meat as a source of income. Oh, sorry, for the ecological interaction, this is a species interaction. So we found that 80% of fishing location in Muncar is really connected with the elasmo branch. So from the gillnet fisheries, like 87% gillnet fisheries will get the bycatch from sharks and ray, and mostly for mobula ray. And for the ecological things, we also analyze the heavy metals content coming from the mercury, lead, cadmium, and also arsenic. For both these, for all of these, heavy metal is very variative according to the fish size, the species, the length, and also the fishing location. Because in the Muncar, the fishing location is very wide, not only in the Bali Strait, but also to the fastest the far area, because there is a targeted sharks in Muncar. The species that I use, there is 8 sharks and ray in total. This is coming from the interview with the fish smoke processors, because they are the one who responsible to sharing the food to the other consumers. And for the social-ecological interaction, is characterized by interconnected dependency among the local fisheries actors who typically use the meat as a source of income. This is already happened for several generations for fishers and the 5th generation for smoke processors. This interconnection has become a local tradition. As you can see, there's already a 5th generation. And also in Banyuwangi, they eat at least twice a week. And not only the coastal community, but surrounding Banyuwangi area is really depend on this elasmo branch meat consumption. And we also asked about the alternative to change the elasmo branch meat as their source of food. Mainly they are answering about the like a mackerel and bonito because there is a same preparation with the smoke process, but the 70% people are saying there is no other things that can change the elasmobranch meat food as a food. We also doing a landing monitoring from 6 months. We do monitoring. We found like 71 species search and ray with over 3,000 landing species. Mostly coming from the Dashyatidae and Carcharidae family, and mostly church and ray that found in Muncar is vulnerable to endangered species. This is the last part about the emergent system. So the illustration highlight the key social-ecological drivers influencing elasmobranch meat utilization in Banyuwangi, Indonesia. To summarize, the utilization influenced by the ecological condition, market forces, cultural preference, and livelihood dependency, with governance gap complicating fisheries management. To sustainable management requires integrating conservation, food safety, community needs, and strengthening monitoring. So protecting elasmobranch is not just about the animals for low and the middle income country. It's about understanding the people who depend on them. Our teaching emphasized that conservation without considering local community can fail, just as supporting community without awareness can deplete resources. The delicate balance between human and nature's the main solution that respect both. Thank you for all donors and sponsors.
Thank you, Irianies. We will move on to our last speaker before we break for lunch. Please find everyone at lunch and ask all your questions. Our last speaker for this session, please join me in welcoming Siti Zanuba, who's going to present on the trade chain of shark meat in Indonesia.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to listen this presentation. My name is Siti Zanuba Aisyah. I'm from Rekam Nusantara Foundation in Indonesia. And today I would like to present our research about mapping the trade chain of shark meat in Indonesia, gaps and governance challenges. So let's start with simple question. Why do shark and ray even matters as trade commodity? I think you all know. The answer is value. The global trade was dominated by shark fin, but following the increasing international restriction, also the growing public awareness about the shark finning, the utilization of shark has become more diverse. And today, shark meat is become increasingly important of the trade. It represents 2.2 billion US dollar, and Indonesia plays a significant role in the trade, particularly on supply and production. So, how big is Indonesia contribution? Indonesia fishers produce between 16,000 until 45,000 tons of shark annually. Of that, between 1,300 until 9,000 tons are exported each year. But it should be concerned us. Despite the high economic value and also international regulation, shark meat trade chain in Indonesia remain complex and fragmented. It creating a critical gaps in traceability and also CITES compliance. So, our research have three core questions. For the first, who are the key actors move the shark meat through the system? And the second, what is the actual pattern of shark meat trade chain in Indonesia? And the last, what are the gaps and governance challenges so it makes difficult to monitor and regulate it? We combine two approaches. We began with desktop study to compile some of data and information among institutions in Indonesia, and we collect some of the literature. And then we conduct field survey from August until December 20 and 23 in pilot location in west of Indonesia and middle of Indonesia. We use direct observation and also semi-structured interview with key informant on landing site and processing step and also in local market. We use the data to build a comprehensive of the shark trade chain in Indonesia. So, who move shark meat through the system. We identify 7 key actors. It starts from fisher who catch shark from the ocean and bring them to the landing site. And then from the general collector, which we call first collector, will purchase the shark either from auction or direct sale. And the shark will move to the specific collector, which we fins or meat collector. And some the product will move to processor, who transform the shark product into other added value item. And retailer will sell the product into local market on the domestic demand. And exporter who move shark meat to the big market in international. And the last is the important is consumer, both domestically and international. So that is the pattern of shark meat trade chain in Indonesia. I think it's very complicated. We divide it into categories. First is small scale vessel and the second is large scale vessel. For small scale vessel, we have 4 pathways. For the first is most direct for fishermen, and then move to first collector and direct move to the local market. So the product is commonly fresh. And the pathways 2, it's adding the salting processing. It's from fisher and then move to first collector, move again to second level collector and move to the local market. So the product is commonly salted meat because it adding the salting processing. And the pathways 3 and pathways 4 is involving the big collectors in big cities in Indonesia because in Java like Jakarta and Surabaya and some cities like Makassar, Medan and also Denpasar. Pathways 3 reach a national market and pathways 4 reach an international market. And the second is large scale vessel up to the 30 gross tons. We have 2 pathways. You need to think that the chain is shorter, but the volume is bigger because fisher up 30 gross ton with the deliver directly into big collector and big collector will supply either from national market or international market. So this is the map how to distribution and route domestic shark meat in Indonesia. I think it's very complicated, but it's very unique. The distribution is all of the Java. You can see that the shark meat trade route is not just from local, but it's moved to provincial boundaries. So it's very unique. And beyond Indonesia borders, shark meat trade chain Indonesia reached 12 countries, and China is by far the dominant destination, followed by Malaysia. And some region or countries like Thailand, Singapore, Vietnam, Hong Kong, South Korea is all a major recipient. And countries like Algeria, Sri Lanka, India, and Japan is not big trade shark meat, but it's also the run out of the destination. So what are the gaps and governance challenges? We divided 3 gaps and governance. For the first is data quality. Species level data is largely missing because most catch records only at genus level or simply categorized as shark only. So it impact to the challenging for monitor and to record and evidence policy and also the data national. And the second is informal and unrecorded transaction. You can see the video. Some of shark sell to the local market without record, cash-based, and direct transaction. So it makes difficult to trace the origin of species identity. And the last is product transformation. Fresh shark is converted to salted or dry products. So it can obscure the species identity and also the enabling not compliant product to enter formal trade. So, based on our finding, we have 4 recommendations. For the first, we need to improve data collection because data is very important. We recommend to mandating on species level data in all fish landing sites in Indonesia. And we need to have a standardized logbook system and also digital system so it can fetch into a national database. When we have a good database, we can explore how to management to the shark meat trade chain in Indonesia. And the second is strengthening the monitoring capacity. The monitoring capacity is not just for government, but also for community-based citizen science, fish collector, processor, because they have important role in the trade chain. And we can implement based on the high volume landing site in Indonesia, like Java. And then the third is we need to build traceability and also regulation. We develop a national database traceability system, and also it's important we need to improve product labeling standards so we can now share with the origin and the types and the processing types. And we need to strengthen data sharing among stakeholders, among the major of countries. And the last, we need to invest on public awareness and education, not just for fishing or coastal communities, but also equally for policymakers, consumers, and processor and the border of supply chain, because they have a role important in the trade chain. And the last, if the demand of shark meat still on, the trade is still continue exist. And the shark meat trade chain in Indonesia is very fast, complex, and fragmented. To address the challenge and gaps, we need to have a better data, greater monitoring, improved traceability, and also collaboration. And I would like to say thank you for UK government and CIFAS through the Illegal Wildlife Challenge Fund, and also Mote Marine Laboratory and Aquarium who support this research and attend me to this event. And thank you very much for your attention.
Hello. Thank you so much. Since we are breaking for lunch, I think we can spare time for one question. Takers? Oh. Do we have any questions? Going once, going twice. All right, enjoy lunch. We will see you promptly at 2:30. Enjoy lunch. Thank you.
Hello everybody. Yeah, thanks for the attention. Hi everyone, I'm so grateful today standing here in this stage again for the second time. So across shark expert across the world in Sri Lanka. So this is my first Sharks International. This is very interesting for me. For the shark enthusiast, shark fin or the shark fin soup is the common things, but is it the real shark fins or the ray fin soup? I'm Aga, shark specialist from WWF Indonesia, also supported by our team, Rani Yuneni, and also Adrianus from Indonesia. We'll share our study regarding the DNA evidence reveals critically endangered rhino race in his consumption during Lunar New Year in Indonesia. And as you know, Indonesia is located in center of the coral triangle between the Pacific and Indian Ocean, home for more than 2,126 Elasmobranch species. And as you can see in the picture, because majority people of Indonesia live in coastal and island area, shark meat become an additional protein source because they are cheapest. And in addition, shark fin also consumed in the big cities and sometimes for the special occasions such as a Lunar New Year, and high diversity and also high demand for international and domestic markets bring Indonesia as the one of the world shark fishing country. But there is the gap. When the sharks become a food, the species is unknown. Maybe in the previous slide is always talk about the shark meat, but today we will talk about the shark fin soup in Indonesia, specifically in the Lunar New Year. We have two objectives. The first one is collecting and compiling an online database that restaurants provide the sharks menu. And the second is we gathered in-depth information directly from the restaurants for the weight portion, species, customer, and anything. And we were focused on the three big cities, which Jakarta, Surabaya, and Bali. because the cities become shark city hubs and also supply chain, and also many seafood restaurants distribute on those cities. We divided into two methods, online and offline. For the online, it's basically like you were observing the restaurants in the Instagram or Google, but specifically for the seafood restaurant, you can searching on the Google with a specific keyword, shark fin soup Jakarta, shark fin soup Bali, and when the restaurant suggestions came up, you can open and collect the information, the menu, price, link, photo, and anything, and input to the database. And then after we collected the online database, we visited several restaurants in each city, and in-depth interview with the head chef or the restaurant's manager regarding the species, and then weight estimation, stocks, and anything. And the last one is we need to take away the shark fin soup and then preserve the sample. And the last one is sent to the Bionesia laboratory to DNA analyze. And as you can see, for the results, the online results, we obtained 75 restaurants across the 3 cities, 41 in Jakarta, 22 in Surabaya, and 12 in Bali, with the top menu is a shark fin with the price range around 8 until $120 per bowl. And for the market survey, we visited 14 restaurants, 2 in Jakarta, 7 in Surabaya, and 5 in Bali, and all of seafood restaurants able to provide shark fin soup every single day, with containing average 50 grams of shark's needles or hayseed per bowl, with the same price range. And you can see the normal day stocks, the restaurants able to provide 70 kilograms of shark's needles per day. And this number increased triplets to 240 kilograms per day in Lunar New Year period. And we collected 13 samples of the shark fin soup. Yeah, this is the general estimation. Based on our in-depth interview, all of restaurants able to provide 240 kilograms per day in this period, and all of restaurants fully booked consistently in this period, which spans for a week. So from this number, estimate almost 1.7 tons shark fin needles stock consumed in Lunar New Year period. And if we use average 50 grams per bowl of shark fins, it's equivalent with 33,950 bowls of shark fin soup. And we calculate this with the Sharkulator, the platform developed by WWF Hong Kong to generate blue sharks from wet fin to the dry fin. This number is equivalent with 4,035 individuals of sharks. Then, if we use assumption the average price of the shark fins is $12, the total value in this period is around $417,000. Yep, this is the important things and the surprise. Actually, the shark fin soup on the menu is not sharks, but the ray. And 10 of 13 samples we were able to analyze shows that the shark fin soup containing the critically endangered rhino rays. The first one is Rhynchobatus australiae, Rhynchobatus palprobatus, Rhynchobatus springray, Rhinankylostomus, and the last one, Glaucus typus. So this is interesting, and the head chef, the manager restaurants always said they always using this type of the fin because this is the great quality and the favorite for the customer. And always the customer always requests this type of the fin, even though the people don't know this species, but this is the rhino, critically endangered rhino race. And this is the shifting species. We did the same analysis, even though in the different restaurants, but still similar. We still found the shark species in before COVID, like the dusky, hammerhead, treasure, and tiger. So it's like a shifting species if we compare the previously. the all of results is rhino rays. And also we found the chicken and crab in the shark fin soup in a bowl. So maybe it's a food fraud or not. We never know. Yeah, but yeah, you can see the comparison. Yeah, this is the rhino ray species, all of every single shark fin, and then this is the shark species. Yep, this is the last slide. After the cytoscope in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, there's amendment for the zero export quota for these species, specifically Rhinidae and Glaucostegidae. This will affect the fish collector because the supplier, the fish collector, the remain stock not able to export to other countries. So they will sell and distribute to the domestic market. That's why, therefore, we, with other partners and NGO, we trying to collaborate with the management and scientific authority to for the stock assessment and quota analyze. And also, we need to structure public awareness to highlight the ecological impact for the sharks and ray in the ocean, and also help for the human. And the last one is we need to collaborate with the multi-stakeholders, such as restaurants, wedding organizer, hotels, and anything. This is the key to shifting behavior to reducing the consumption of the shark fin soup or the ray fin soup in Indonesia. So I know the time is limited, but thank you. That's all from me.
Okay, so we actually have quite a long time for questions, so I promised I wouldn't do too many because we've got a gap now. So has anybody got a question, please?
For the restaurants that you did the market survey for, had you already identified them as selling shark fin soup when you did the online search?
Yes, basically the first one is we collected the online database. We trying to find that restaurant in the Google, and after we got the database, we chose the restaurant in each city, and we visited the restaurant and gathered in-depth information from that. So basically, the first one is online, and then after that we visited the restaurants there. Like, so basically, it's the same restaurant with the database.
Any more questions? Maybe one more would be good.
Thank you. I got a really good presentation. I also seen the tunus tonggol in your genetic analysis. Yeah. Is that the same restaurant with the chicken and crab? And do you think it's good that they're using another species than shark? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Isan. Basically, tunus tonggol or tongkol is not the part of the shark fin soup DNA, but it's an outsider in the phylogenetic tree for the comparison between the shark, ray, and other species.
Great, okay. I think I will, unless there's any other burning questions. Okay, I feel like that was...
Okay, a lot of questions.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, interesting talk. I'm just wondering, when you talk to the chefs or people in the restaurant, were you able to ask where did they get the meat or source of their fins from?
Yeah, actually we asked them, but not all of head chef or the restaurant's manager answer it, but we trying to, as I can, we trying to use a cover with other friends, trying to like did the wedding family or family dinner or anything. So the head chef give the answer from the supply the sharks of the fin.
Fab.
Okay.
Okay, I think I'll let you go.
Any
off the
question
stage.
again, or?
I think you could go off the stage if you want
Okay.
to.
Thank you so much, all. Goodbye.
Okay, so we do actually have a flicker.
Hi everyone, this is Saurabh from India. So today I'm going to talk about about the elastomerbank bycatches in India mostly. So what's the big research question over here that I have to address? So India is among the top 3 elastomerbank harvesting nations globally, and it requires like one of the most stringent measures, okay, like the stringent protection measures, conservation measures. Yet there is no comprehensive, actually there is no comprehensive data or comprehensive, okay, thank you so much. There is no comprehensive baseline that we can use for knowing the different diversities and like what are the range of these species that are found in India. So we designed our studies in such a way that we conducted around 100 days of field trips that was divided equally among both coasts, 50 days in each coast and 50 days in West Coast, from 16 harbors, like 8 harbors from the East Coast and 8 harbors from the West Coast. Overall, we got around a sample size of 24,902 individuals from 8 coastal states, and the studies were mainly conducted from from February to September of 2024 and a bit till 2025 also. Okay, so what are our results? What did we found? We found exactly around 73 species of elastomerangs that were frequently caught and that were used for consumptions, human consumption in different ways. We found roughly 32 species of sharks, 40 species of rays. In the West Coast was much more diverse compared to the East Coast. The West Coast had a H index of 2.53, and East Coast had an H index of 1.82. And the Bray-Curtis dissimilarity was exactly 0.624. If we compared the dissimilarity between the East Coast and the West Coast, the Bray-Curtis dissimilarity was actually 0.624, which suggests that both these coasts had their fair share of differences. So Scoliodon latichodus was the most caught shark, and among brays, Babytrigon imbricata was the most caught species. And the subsidiary results also included that we saw a number of juvenile species that were caught. The primary juvenile species that we saw in most dominant was in Spirina lewini, 96%, Atobatus oscillatus, 84%, Glucostegus granulatus, 84%, 76%, Movula movular, 70%, and Carcharanus luca, 66%. So a shifting of conservation status. So what does the conservation status right now stands? If we compare a decadal years of conservation status, like India has taken a lot of steps. So where the conservation status stands right now. So we can see that the critical species has rose from 3% to 13% over the last 10 years, from 2014 to 2024. 5% to 25% for endangered species, that's a sharp rise of 20%, and vulnerable species rising from 26% to 35%. That's a rise of 9%. We believe that 4 species could be extinct, regionally extinct from Indian water. Why I say extinct? Because they haven't been observed for the last 10 years. And 27 CITES species were observed, frequently to be caught in the harbors. So what's the way forward and what are the things that we can implement? So we can implement Wildlife Protection Act 1972. That has already been implemented by the government of India, but I have found that in most of the coastal states, they are not properly implemented. There are many harbors that catch these species frequently. So we need to properly implement Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 and CITES at different landing centers. Protect estuarine nursery ground. There are a number of species that are caught frequently in critical nursery areas. So we should protect those nursery areas, and key spatial and temporal measures should be taken to protect this nursery ground. Implement mesh size regulation for bycatch. We can implement mesh size regulation also, and bottom trawl fishing can be completely eradicated. Finally, eDNA monitoring for cryptic species can be done to know more about the whereabouts of these cryptic species. And regional cooperation across South Asia can be implemented so that we can provide a holistic conservation approach. And subsidiary like to that, I found a new species of Hemitragon beniti in different parts of India. And finally, the key conclusions that 76 species we have found, West Coast being more diverse than the East Coast, 70 to 96% of the juvenile catch, indicating a collapse, population collapse. Endangered species, critically endangered species rising from 3 to 13%. Banned species are still being landed, and we can extend the range of Hemitragon beniti in like one of our subsidiary results.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. Now, next up, we have Nadia, who is taking us beyond tacos.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here sharing with you. Then, if we ask to a Mexican if we are eating sharks in our country, the principal answer is going to be no. But a different one we are going to have if we ask for cazón. Because cazón is one of the principal ingredients in many dishes around the country. For some states are even the identity part of the culinary or cuisine there. As this that I'm showing here that we call pan de cazón. For cazón, we are understanding all the species that are small sharks. And this could become problematic because depending on the region, we can be talking about more than 20 species. That is why it's always important asking and indicate which kind of cazón people is using. Also because this concept is linked only to the size, could be related with exploitation of nurseries in many species. For this, we are starting a project where we are investigated in 2 states of Mexico by 3 approaches. That is the local knowledge, market visit, but important for me is to start a genetic monitoring for places where it's not so too easy to get this information. So we are visiting some restaurants, market, and indicate with people to understand this. Our results so far are really interesting because in the 2 states we are registering a really different species composition. In the Gulf of Mexico also is highlighted that there are some species that are not really expected in the region, not because they doesn't exist there, but because according to national statistics, these are not the most abundant. For example, Sphyrna mocarran, and here we are complementing the analysis, doing seasonality, looking for the seasonality in the restaurants. In the case of the states in the Mexican Caribbean, you can see that the principal methodology is genetics, because here it's really hard to get information as this state is the most touristic place in Mexico. So really doesn't exist a big market, but always it's important to understand that they are many nurseries areas, and also species are not really well documented. Our results so far, and the next we are taking or getting, are important in the context of the international and national market in Mexico. Since the international point of view, we are always in the top 10 meat producers. And important consider that the 90% of the meat are consumed in the local communities. Our results are improving or are helping to improve more than a regional and local management, considering the difference of every state in Mexico, but also for the nurseries identification, identify a species substitution that is happening a lot in Mexico, transparency and awareness about the consumption. As this project is part of a bigger one, there are many people to say thank you, but also we are creating a really good collaborator network in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. Then, if you are interested in our projects, we have not just genetics, but also other kind of monitorings, or keep in touch if you want to visit Cancun. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. If you could grab Nadia for questions afterwards, that would be good. We're next going to move to the UK. Joanna Murray.
Okay. Whew, it was a long wait. Okay, let's get straight to it. So Squalosacanthus, or spur dog, was a commercially important species in the northeast Atlantic in the 50s and 60s, and it was predominantly caught by gill nets and trawls as bycatch and as a component of the targeted inshore fishery. Following the levels seen in the 50s and 60s, there was substantial population declines, which led to the introduction of a total allowable catch for the North Sea in the 2000s. Further restrictions followed until in 2010, a zero tax was applied to all EU and UK vessels fishing in UK and EU waters. Spur dog was also listed as prohibited, which meant that discarding was allowed to avoid choke risk to the fisheries. And then between 2017 and 2022, a conditional bycatch quota was introduced in the UK, permitting 100 tonnes of spur dog to be landed each year. But then in 2022, the IC's scientific advice changed, supporting landings, and the EU and UK agreed to remove the prohibited status and allocate TAC in 2022. And as an additional precautionary measure, individuals more than 100 centimetres could not be retained as a method to deter targeting of the large fecund females. So our project began when the TAC was introduced in 2023 to really try and understand what the industry's response to the management changes for spur dog were, whereby all individuals less than 100 centimetres in size had to be landed under the landing obligation. So to do this, we conducted in-person surveys of the catching and onshore sector in 2023 and 2024. So we surveyed 15 fishers and 10 processors to try and understand the industry perspectives. And what we learned from the catching sector was that spur dog prices are generally very low, with only the largest individuals reaching good prices. And the small fish were said to be very difficult to process and to sell, so there was no incentive to use the TAC. And they also reported that during the closure, processing skills and infrastructure in the market had disappeared, and they didn't think that it would rebuild. They also felt that the quota was too high and that the damage to the gear and the low price meant that there was no incentive to land it, and that they saw it as a bycatch and not a targeted fishery. And one fisher said that the quota is just too much and dogs are being killed for no reason. For the onshore sector, they reported that demand was low prices, low incentive to land, and that the long closure had led to a lost consumer demand in the UK, as well as international markets in Italy and Germany. And the current small market was easily saturated, and they couldn't compete with imports from North America, which had filled the demand during the closure. The quota, they also said that the quota exceeds what the market can absorb, and that changes to the regulation alone won't rebuild the fishery. So by engaging with the catching and onshore sector, we were able to gain insights about the complexities of reintroducing a previously prohibited species, especially around the practical and operational considerations which may affect sustainability of the fishery. However, just a point that the study doesn't end here, because actually at the UK and EU negotiations in October 2025, the management measures changed again, and the parties agreed to remove the size limit of 100 centimetres, and so now all spur dog of all sizes must be landed, but within a reduced quota. So it's another shift in management, and it's something that we'll need to keep an eye on to see how the industry respond. Thank you.
All right. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker, Claire Collins, and she will be talking about meeting the demand using consumer choice insights to design shark conservation policy. Take it away, Claire.
Thank you very much. So I am going to take you back to Sri Lanka and India now, and I'm going to talk about how we can use consumer choice data to design shark conservation policy. So within this project, our research questions were understanding more about the patterns of consumption and the trends in them, what role do contextual, social and cultural drivers play in this demand, and then also we're looking at what is the influence of specific product attributes on this decision making. So we have done sort of a lot of stuff, and I'm not going to talk about it all today, but we started off by doing around 250 in-depth interviews all across our study sites, which is the southern state of Kerala in India, and across all the provinces in Sri Lanka. So these were with consumers, sellers, traders, and we were basically collecting rich qualitative data with which we could design our more targeted surveys following that. So these surveys, we did 931 overall, and they collected socio-demographic data, proxy for income, average age of household, as well as trying to understand consumption frequency, preference, and also we asked them to make choice using choice cards, but I don't have enough time to go into that today. So what did we find? Basically, we found that in India, the most common frequency reported was less than once a month, and in Sri Lanka, it was slightly higher, so once or twice a month. We only had around 5 in India and 10% in Sri Lanka, people reporting that they were eating it on a weekly basis, and only 1% said they ate it every day. And just to put this into context, around half of our participants said that they ate fish every day. We, interestingly, if you caught Nidhi's talk earlier, we found that contrary to what we expected, there was much higher consumption within the inland areas than the coastal areas, which reflects potentially the importance of the dried fish market within both study sites. And interestingly, people reported mostly status quo in terms of consumption, with many people also saying decreasing, with hotspots for decreasing in southern India and also hotspots for increasing in northeast Sri Lanka. So this potentially reflects patterns in the fisheries. In terms of preference, we had around a quarter of our participants in Sri Lanka and India saying that they preferred shark always to finfish, and we had really interesting regional patterns in that as well, so it's definitely not a countrywide sort of pattern. And we found that when we looked at ray preference, it was much higher in India, if you can see in C there, and this was particularly, again, concentrated in the southern part of Kerala. So when we did our interviews and our surveys, availability was emerging as the key factor, so thinking about sort of a supply-driven market, I guess. And it was that fresh shark and ray meat was more widely available in Sri Lanka than India, and many people said they couldn't access shark in India in particular. Ray meat in general was more available in coastal locations, but when we look at these patterns of availabilities in terms of these spatial maps, and we track it against consumption sort of frequency, it's not that they don't exactly match. So as many of the talks earlier were saying, it's not just availability. It's not just that they're there, so people are eating them. There's obviously other things at play as well. So just to go over some of the stuff that we've already talked about today, there are some really key social cultural drivers that are driving these regional patterns that we're seeing. So health came up in all of our study sites as really key in driving it. And also taste, again, was a really, really key factor. People just prefer to eat it. So why do we think these kind of studies are important? We think it's really important because if we collect this data, then we have the ability to design behavior change and awareness campaigns that look to influence the many rather than regulating the few, e.g. the fishers. And we also think it's really important to keep understanding which components of shark and rays are specifically driving the trade in them and the exploitation. We often think about fins and gill plates as a sort of wealth-driven markets and meat as a poverty-driven market, but as I think we're discussing a lot today, that's not always the case. We also think doing studies at this granular level is really important for sharks and rays because it supports the continued devolution of sort of policy making. It's not that these trends are across a whole entire country. They're very much operating on a regional basis as well. So just to say thank you to my funders and also all of my amazing co-authors, many of whom are here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire. Our next speaker is Josephine, and she's going to take us all the way to southern Australia.
Hi, everyone. So as we heard this morning, there is a substantial shark meat market in Australia, and those fillets are sold under the label of flake. Now, the Australian Fish Name Standards suggest that this should refer to Mustelus antarcticus or Mustelus lenticulatus. but we know that a really broad range of species are sold under this label. So first and foremost, I wanted to assess the flake trade in Southeast Australia, looking at both the species that are sold and also the accuracy of their product labels. What this showed us that was while mislabeling levels were relatively low, we had quite a high instance of ambiguous labeling, which increased along the supply chain towards the consumer. Breathe. When we looked at the species that were sold, roughly a quarter of our samples were one of those recommended musterless species, but 1 in 5 was the nationally conservation-dependent school shark. Some of you know it as taupe shark or soupfin shark. So because this species was so prevalent in the trade, we wanted to look at tools that could be used to ID them. And the first tool that we looked at was loop-mediated isothermal amplification, better known as LAMP, which is a genetic-based presumptive identification tool that can be used for species-specific identification. For us, our main target species was that school shark, and our main non-target species was the musterless genus. We focused on the ND2 region, and as we can see in our nice little amplification plot, we have our target species showing that really nice curve above our amplification threshold, and all of that mess down the bottom is our non-target species. So that is what we wanted to see. The next tool that we looked at was Raman spectroscopy, which, simple terms, we pointed a laser at a fillet of fish and we wanted to see if we could use the wavelength that was returned to distinguish between species. We tested this across a number of shark and related species with reasonable classification success, and most of our misclassification happened within that Triachidae family, so our school gummy whiskery, and we think that that was likely due to some ecological similarities, like their diet and habitat. It's also important to note that both of these tools that I have mentioned here can be adapted to work in the field for hands-on monitoring. So to really quickly sum up the last 4 years of my life, I assessed the flake trade in South Australia, and we found that ambiguous labelling along the supply chain that increased towards the consumer, which really highlighted the need for accurate species identification at those different supply chain stages. And what I've presented here is a couple of identification tools that can be used in the field for rapid, cost-effective species identification. Thank you.
Very much. I think just in the interest of time, I'll just ask people to grab you afterwards, if that's okay. So we are ethno-nutritional beliefs of shark meat consumption.
Good afternoon all. I'm Premadasa. I'm here to share our findings on ethno-nutritional beliefs of shark meat consumption on lactate production of pregnant and breastfeeding mothers in Sri Lanka. I'm a volunteer researcher at Ocean Rosy Organization and graduate from Faculty of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, Ocean University of Sri Lanka. Cultural food beliefs during pregnancy and breastfeeding are commonly rooted in many communities. Some of these beliefs directly influence maternal nutrition as well as infant health. One such belief we observe in our local context is consuming shark meat, especially for consuming shark meat for the purpose of enhancement lactation. For this study, we interviewed 400 pregnant and breastfeeding mothers, 100 from each 4 MOH officers from southern coast towards the central part of Sri Lanka. Moving on to results, out of 400 participants, 281 pregnant and breastfeeding mothers had heard about this belief that enhanced lactation through shark meat consumption, which is 70% of total respondents. But overall, only 38% believe this statement. Even though Ratnapura is more inland, here you can see that 11% in the highest percentage of respondents believe that statement that shows that the statement that shows that this belief is spreading to beyond the coastal communities through cultural transmission. However, out of 400, 185 did not believe this belief, and 62 mentioned they were uncertain about this belief. When we ask about when we ask about the factor that learn about this belief, majority 61% mentioned their parents and 31% mentioned their grandparents. However, when asked about the trusted or the reliable factor to choose shark meat for the enhancement of lactation, majority 56% mentioned healthcare professionals. Hence, the preference could be made upon trusted sources rather than cultural belief. Here we need to continue our studies with an island-wide survey, including views of healthcare professionals. Ocean Rossi organization is being continued this study to achieve these aspects in future. I'm grateful to Dr. Pushpita Balleguru, Ocean University of Sri Lanka, for facilitating our connection with Southern Coast MOH officers and all the pregnant and breastfeeding mothers and all the dedicated staff in 4 MOH officers for their generous support during our survey. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. We have got time for a question, if anybody's got any questions.
That was a great talk. I don't know if I missed it, but how did you choose where to locate mothers for the study?
Sorry?
How did you choose, like what locations did you go to elicit mothers for the study?
Actually, this is a preliminary study, and we are supposed to conduct in all the island-wide. So just we started our study from coastal side towards the inland. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We are now going to kick off our panel on more than 25 years on from IPOA-Sharks. That's the International Plan of Action for Sharks. This panel is slightly different in format to some that you might have already been to, so we haven't got a preceding theme session. So we're going to start with a series of scene-setting presentations, just to bring everyone up to speed who's not necessarily familiar with this framework. And we're going to look at some what IPOA-Sharks is, its development. We're going to look at some key findings from a study. And then we're going to look at what's changed over the time since its implementation. These scene-setting presentations are going to be delivered by our co-conveners for this session. And then we're going to move to a panel discussion where our esteemed panel will join us on the stage and help answer some questions about this. And then at the end, there will be a chance to have a bit of an open floor Q&A session where you can pose some questions on IPOA-Sharks and its future to the panel. So just to kick off, I'm one of the conveners of this session. I'm Sophie McCulley-Phillips from CFAS in the UK, so that's the Fisheries Laboratory of the government. I work across biology, ecology, assessment and advice, and I'm really happy to be one of the co-conveners. So without further ado, I pass you over to Monica, who is also one of the co-conveners for the first scene-setting presentation.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm Monica Barone, Fisheries Research Consultant for FAO. I've worked for FAO since a long time, but not at the time that the IPOA was adopted. I was not there still at that time. So I wanted to, first of all, show to you the first document for where the IPOA was published in, I'm going to tell you a bit more about the background. Just some important years. The Committee of Fisheries recognized the necessity to have an international agreement for this, with the asterisks, means seabirds and longline fisheries, sharks, and fishes capacity. There were some issues that were out at that time. And in 1999, the IPOA were adopted in the 23rd session of the FAO Commission on Fisheries. Then it's interesting to see that inside this small document, as there are three international plan of action published together, the plan of action for sharks is made only of 5 pages. And I'm going to tell you more about some of the, let's say, the keywords inside this document. First of all, with regard to the guiding principles, it's at the point 14, we see that management and sustaining the stock, this is one of the principles. So the management and conservation strategy should aim to keep total fish mortality for each stock within sustainable levels by applying the precautionary approach. This is a fisheries language, of course. But the precautionary approach is the key words here, because we are in the framework of the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. And so the absence of adequate scientific information should not be used as a reason for postponing or failing to take measures to conserve target species, associated or dependent species, and non-target species and their environment. This is a key message of this document, and it was okay. Then, with regard to the implementation, we know that the states at that time, now we will talk about countries and territories eventually, should adopt a national plan of action if their vessels regularly catch sharks in non-direct fisheries. Let's say this is the most common situation. And each state is responsible for developing, implementing, and monitoring its shark plan. Just remember this, because I will talk about this during the panel. Then we have the famous 10 main aims of the IPOA-Sharks that we usually, we have a lot, used a lot these 10 aims when drafting a plan of action, a national plan of action, sort of guidance or sort of checklist for making a good draft. And then also important is the role of FAO, because FAO will, through the Committee of Fisheries, report biannually on the state of progress in the implementation of the IPOA-Sharks. So FAO has interpreted this biannual report in a mode that is quite vague, because some years they did not report, some years countries request a revision of the implementation of the IPOA-Sharks. And if you remember, the first document on the Fisheries et al. In 1997 was a key document for the revision of the implementation of the IPOA-Sharks. Now, currently, FAO decided to move this, let's say, mandate to revise the IPOA-Shark on the website. This is also out of date. I can say that we are going to update as well the website. Anyway, some fun figures just about the increase or the adoption of plan of action. Starting from 2001 to 2026, we are more or less 51 plan of action adopted at national level. Some remained always as a draft or unofficial, and 12 countries have some revision, did some revisions as is needed. So on the right, you have the cumulative curve for the plans. And this is just a map to show that there are both national plan of action and regional plan of action covering almost quite well. Let's say there are many areas that are covered by this kind of tool. That I remember you that this is a voluntary tool. And this is so far the situation. So I will pass the floor to Sophie, who will continue to tell you something more about the revision of the plan of action.
Okay, thanks, Monica. So I am clearly not Eric Gilman. Unfortunately, he could not be here today to give his presentation, but he was one of our co-conveners and has been really influential in helping to plan this session. So I'd really like to acknowledge that, and it's a shame he can't be here to join us. So he has asked me to deliver the presentation on his behalf, which is presenting some key findings from the 2023 study that assessed the implementation of the International Plan of Action for Sharks, and it evaluated all of the global and national and regional shark action plans. And I'd also like to acknowledge Lauren, who is here and is one of the co-authors on this paper. So what this study found is that most shark action plans were actually out of date. There was limited use of SMART objectives, so specific, measurable, achievable, and time-bound objectives. There were no outcome objectives that specified an end result change in the conservation status of the shark population, and there were very few performance assessments. And therefore, this made most national plans of action inadequate for planning and assessing efficiency. Furthermore, over a third of annually retained catch of sharks and relatives was from countries without national plans of action, and 12% was from countries with, less than 12% was actually from countries that had current national plans of action. So the action plans identified some of the largest obstacles to implementation, and these included fisheries management framework deficits, ecology, knowledge gaps, institutional capacity and coordination shortfalls, and finally, budget constraints as the largest obstacles to this implementation. So what this figure shows is the trend in landed chondrichthyan catches as a function of the year that the 48 countries and territories that first adopted a national plan of action. Countries and territories with higher landed chondrichthyan catches were largely early adopters of national plans of action, while those with lower catches were generally more recent adopters. With a third of global chondrichthyans landed catch now from fisheries of nations without a national plan of action, in addition to needed improvements to the international plan of action and national action plans, it's a priority to have the remaining nations that have high chondrichthyan fishing mortality to adopt shark action plans. So has the shark plan improved chondrichthyan conservation and management? Well, combined, the old age of most shark plans now and few performance assessments, which have hindered by the little use of SMART objectives, indicates that national plans of action are largely inadequate for effective planning and assessing the efficacy of activities for the conservation and management of chondrichthyans. With only 9 of the 55 national plans of action having undergone a performance assessment, and only 3 reporting time-bound objectives and that they had achieved these, the study findings were inconclusive on the effects of implementation of IPOA-Sharks and on the conservation and management of chondrichthyans.
So countries might be using national plans of actions as an end per se to meet this soft law obligation, but not as a means for planning chondrichthyan management activities. So finally, this study recommended adoption of a supplement to the IPOA-Sharks to better support the adoption and effective design and implementation of national plans of action. And this slide summarizes the recommendations to that supplement, which include providing specific guidance on criteria that warrant national plan of action adoption, suitable for both data-rich and data-limited conditions, explaining benefits of the SMART objectives for effective active management implementation and performance assessments, providing guidance on how national plans can address deficits in fisheries monitoring, control, surveillance, enforcement, and outcomes of enforcement actions, and describe how regional plans can complement but not replace national plans. Their recommendations, including outcome objectives, identifying options for effective chondrichthyan bycatch management, and by highlighting the importance of accounting for key criteria which consider alternative bycatch strategies, which can include how robust the fisheries management framework is to support compliance monitoring, costs to commercial viability, and likelihood of compliance and conflicts with other threatened species. So that is the end of the study of Eric and his co-authors. And now I pass to our other co-convener, Rima.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Rima Jabado. I'm the chair of the IUCN Species Survival Shark Specialist Group, and I've been asked to be here and convene this because I'm somewhat of a cynic when it comes to national plans of action. In some countries, I think they're particularly important. In others, I wonder what their use has been. And as mentioned here, over the past 25 years, the conservation challenge for sharks' rays and chimeras has fundamentally changed. Basically, the main planning tool, the National Plan of Action that many countries still depend on and talk about, has not. And when it was developed, the focus, as Monica mentioned, was fisheries management, bycatch, promoting the precautionary approach, and the shark fin trade. But today we're dealing with a much more complex system. And what I think is the key question for this session is whether our tools have kept pace with a lot of that change. So in 1990, what we were talking about was a lot of fisheries where sharks were being caught. There wasn't enough space to keep them on the boat, so we would remove the fins, which was the most valuable part, and discard the rest of the body, so that definition of finning. Over time, we have adapted something that the National Plans of Actions have pushed for, which is full utilization, and it means that we have these products that are now that existed in the past, like meat or the liver oil, but they were secondary. They were often local, lower value, and largely under the radar. So the National Plans of Actions were built around that reality of what did we need to do to make sure there was less discard for sharks. And the shift has been very clear in terms of the market. We're seeing this huge diversification. And it shouldn't just be called the National Plan of Action for Sharks. We're forgetting rays and chimeras in that definition. But essentially, we've had products that existed in the past, but that have expanded a lot. I think we've heard a lot about the meat trade, the gills, the liver, the skins. There's also cartilage. If you live in Asia, you know that there's a huge product for that. But you can also, sell CITES-listed species and buy them so that your dogs or your cats can munch on them. And so huge changes in the way that these fisheries need to be managed and these trade systems need to be managed. And I wanted to give one example through CITES and how that has changed over the years, and particularly since 1999. And it was actually in 1994, so 4 years after the IUCN Shark Specialist Group was set up, where the founding members went to CITES and said, well, we have a problem and we need to do something. And they had a resolution that passed, but it took more than 10 years before anything started to happen. And when it did start to happen in 2003, it was limited to 2 species, the basking shark and the whale shark, charismatic species that were listed on Appendix 2. Fast forward a little bit more to 2007, you had the sawfishes that were listed on Appendix 1, the first species, and up until recently, the only species where commercial trade was prohibited. And as we moved forward at every COP, every conference of parties, we have an additional number of species that were listed, including rays, which was reflecting really a growing concern about this trade and what we were dealing with and population trajectories. And then by 2022, we had over 80 species that were listed, and just last year, we're now at almost 200 species that were listed, with a growing number of species listed on Appendix 1. And so the real issue with this is there's a major shift towards trade regulation as a conservation tool. But I'm giving an example of CITES because it has a strong compliance mechanism, but there's CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, there's the Shark Memorandum of Understanding, there's increasingly changing mandates within regional fisheries management organizations that are considering conservation measures for sharks and rays. But if you are a country and you are not compliant with CITES, it doesn't matter if you care about orchids or sharks, if your trade is prohibited, it's going to impact you. And so because it has such a strong compliance mechanism, if you are found to be non-compliant with a lot of the CITES actions, actions can be taken. And this is where we've seen that a lot of countries suddenly care about making a change in the conservation and the actions that they have on the ground for this. But still, we're facing challenges around product coverage and species identification. You've heard that yesterday in a session specific to CITES. So the listings have expanded, but we're only regulating part of the system, not the system itself. And so where does that leave national plans of actions? And many are outdated, like we've heard. They lack measurable objectives. They're rarely evaluated. But more fundamentally, they were designed for a different problem. And they were built around that fisheries, around that finning. It's not this complex multi-product trade system that we have now. And even though they did advocate for this full utilization, we're not there in many places just yet. So there's an opportunity here. Many countries still really care about having these voluntary mechanisms that are in place. And we need to be able to make sure, though, that we can adapt them so that they align with the current realities of both regional and international frameworks. So to conclude, just to say that we need to integrate the threat landscape that we currently are facing now into the text of these documents. We need policy frameworks that make sure that we capture all of the changes that have happened and that are continuing to happen very, very rapidly. So we need to be able to be adaptive. And we need to expand this so that it includes other systems, whether it's the meat, whether it's the liver oil, the ray skins, and so on. And these can really draw on increasing mechanisms that exist, because if we remain static, the risk is that we're going to continue having NPOAs being a reporting exercise rather than something that we can actually use for implementation and we can actually use to make change at the level that it's needed. So I think I'll end it there. Thank you very much. And I'll give it back to Sophie. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rima. We are now going to move to our panel discussion. So I'd like to invite our very esteemed panel up, please. We have a great diversity of panel members and esteemed panel members bringing their experience from national plans, regional plans, RFMOs, conservation frameworks and implementation before we turn our thoughts to the future of IPOA-Sharks. Okay, so we have, I can use this one actually. We have Dr. Rhett Bennett to begin with, who is the Scientific Director of the Shark and Ray Conservation at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Rhett works closely with WCS in-country teams and partners to collect scientific data, to inform policy change, engaging with fishing communities to promote more sustainable fishing practices and support government to strengthen national policies, implement global commitments for shark and ray conservation, and tackle illegal trade in shark and ray products. Rhett has recently taken up the position of Regional Vice Chair for Africa under the IUCN Shark Specialist Group. Thank you. And then we move on to Mrs. Sandamali Harath. She is a fisheries management professional with over 16 years experience at the Department of Fisheries and Aquaculture Resources from here in Sri Lanka. She has served as Assistant Director and Deputy Director in Fisheries Management with expertise in sustainable fisheries, shark fisheries and bycatch mitigation. She currently serves as the Director of Quality Control, overseeing fish and fisheries product exports and ensuring compliance with international food safety and certification standards, and has some very relevant experience as they are just about to move forward with the publication of their updated National Plan of Action. We move forward to Lydia Kohler. Her expertise focus on international and regional ocean governance. She's been working on marine-related issues, species conservation, restoration, marine protected areas more than 15 years across sectors and entities, including NGOs, universities, and government bodies. She holds a master's degree in marine science and one in ocean governance, and has a PhD in marine environmental law. And over to Simone. Some of you may have seen her presentation this morning. She is the Regional Manager of WWF, Mediterranean Marine Initiative Species Recovery Programme. Prior to this, she worked for the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and she's been with WWF since 2012, initially focusing on seafood trade, EU policy, and sustainable fisheries management. She leads WWF's efforts on sharks and rays in the Mediterranean, including bycatch mitigation, tagging projects, small-scale fisheries. And since 2025, she served as the coordinator for the Green Deal Working Group on the EU Mediterranean Advisory Council, an EU-level stakeholder body that provides advice on fisheries management to the European Commission and Mediterranean member states. And finally, Monica Barone, who you've already heard from, a shark specialist with a strong passion for species identification and an expert in shark fisheries measures. She holds a PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Pisa in Italy, and has been working as a fisheries resource consultant for FAO since 2009. And in recent years, she's contributed to the Deep Sea Fisheries Project and collaborated with the FAO statistical team on the management of the APHIS list of species for fisheries statistical purposes. So please welcome our esteemed panel. Okay, so I think we can move on with the questions that we are posing to our panel now. So first up, we have Dr. Rhett Bennett. And the question that was posed was, since many chondrichthyans are highly migratory, a single nation's national plan of action for sharks can be undermined by its neighbours' lack of action. How can we strengthen regional plans of action to ensure that safe corridors exist across entire migratory ranges? Over to you, Rhett.
All right, thank you, Sophie. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to the organizers for having me on this panel. I think it's a very interesting topic. Firstly, I agree definitely that the impacts of one country's fishing can have a major impact on neighboring nations' resources. And obviously that's a rational justification for having a regional plan of action, although in many cases, many regions, there are not these existing platforms. But if we go back to the IPOA in the beginning, it does mention the need for having multilateral coordination and cooperation in the development and implementation of national plans of action. So it's not a new concept to have these regional plans that can cover this sort of thing. To answer the question itself, we're asking about how can we bring in some sort of framework within a regional plan of action that can ensure safe corridors for migratory species amongst different countries. And I think there's two aspects that we need to look at here. And one is the kinds of measures that might be brought in, and the other one is the mechanisms with which we might identify measures to bring in. And by saying that, what I mean is there's specific regulations that might be brought in under different existing platforms. And I think countries are very heavily burdened already in terms of conservation agreements, conventions, newly listed species. And countries often complain about the implementation burden that they have when new species are proposed or when there are new measures proposed under the RFMOs or something like that. So what I'm saying here is when we're developing a national plan of action or a regional plan of action, countries shouldn't be reinventing the wheel and bringing in all sorts of new measures and new frameworks. There are many different existing tools that can be brought in already. One of these, obviously, is a good example of this, and I obviously can't cover everything, but CMS, as Rima mentioned, the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species. I mean, this was developed specifically for conserving migratory species, and that's what we're talking about with the regional plan of action. Measures under CMS include things like species listed on Appendix 1 must be strictly protected in CMS party states. And so if a species distribution range spans multiple CMS parties, already the countries should be implementing measures that, that are standardized across the different regions that can protect that species. Other measures under CMS are that parties should be removing barriers to migration of CMS-listed species and conserving habitats, etc. So already there's a huge framework that can be pulled into regional plan of action development. Another aspect under CMS is the fact that species listed on Appendix 2 should have multilateral agreements for their management. And that specifically, that tool can be brought into regional plans of action without, again, reinventing the wheel. And I think the take-home point here is that there are a lot of existing measures, existing frameworks that can be used and carefully brought into a regional plan of action without adding too much extra burden or adding too many extra measures. And I think in some cases, a really carefully crafted regional plan of action could actually reduce implementation burden for countries. Just then quickly before I finish, I think two other aspects that need to be considered is that a regional plan of action can only have strong measures for migratory species or safe corridors for migratory species if you have a regional plan of action. And there are many regions around the world that don't have such a thing. I work in East Africa mainly, and we don't have a regional plan of action there. We spent years developing a regional roadmap for shark and ray conservation through government, engagement with government and academia and NGOs and other stakeholders through multiple platforms, and that was never taken up, unfortunately. And so, obviously, you can't have these safe corridors through regional plans of action if there's no regional plan of action. And then finally, and I'll do my only slide here, which is the one, this one. If we look at that, this is taken from the same paper that Sophie was talking about earlier. Here we can see, the number of countries around the world that have national plans of action. The yellow is basically no plan of action. And those with current plans of action, they have these tiny little components. These are different, the three different graphs are just countries that have different levels of fishing impact. Basically, there are very few countries that have national plans of action. And those themselves are very challenging to develop. And so if a national plan of action, which was called for in 2001, hasn't been developed by 2025, how are we going to get countries to develop regional plans of action, which are going to take significantly more stakeholder engagement than a national plan of action would? So effectively, let's try to provide guidance to countries in developing regional plans of action that are going to minimize burden and lean on existing measures and frameworks. Thank you. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Rat. I think anything that reduces administrative burden will be music to nations' ears. So we move on to Mrs. Sandamali now. And the question that is posed to her is, given that the primary focus of RFMOs, so regional management fisheries organisations, is on tuna, what additional mechanisms can be implemented to ensure that shark conservation doesn't become a secondary or relegated to a bycatch consideration? Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sophie, for this opportunity, and also thanks for the organizers to have this excellent conference in Sri Lanka for the first time in Asia. So actually, this is indeed a very good issue you are highlighting. So this is timely, very timely discussion. So regarding my question, so while regional fisheries management organizations have a primary mandate on tuna and tuna-like species, their primary mandate over the tuna and tuna-like species, but they have very good mechanism in place for the bycatch mitigation that contribute to shark conservation. So those are including that bycatch mitigation measures and also work in delegated working groups. So however, to ensure that shark catches are not threatened in a secondary concern, these measures should be further strengthened. This includes species-specific data collection and reporting, strengthening MCS activities, monitoring, control, and surveillance activities, and some targeted conservation and management measures, particularly for vulnerable species. So those are the measures that further, these shark conservation can be further strengthened. So from Sri Lanka's perspective, that shark catches are mainly come as a bycatch. They are not targeted. Importantly, these catches are fully utilized. This contributes to Sri Lankan food security and also that is good for our low-income families because their main protein source is this. So when considered about food security, this is very important. In the same time, Sri Lanka remains fully committed to sustainable shark fisheries management. This is reflected in measures introduced as early as 2001, that is ban on shark fishery on board fishing vessels. So actually these are the things that Sri Lanka has taken. Currently Sri Lanka is in the process of updating and reviewing and updating our national plan of action in line with international plan of action for the conservation and management of sharks. Moving forward, what is essential is balance and inclusive approach. One that is strengthening conservation measures within the RFMO framework. And it is important to consider, we should consider about the socio-economic aspects and socio-economic realities of developing coastal states. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think similar to Rhett, you're saying the existing frameworks are there, but we need to strengthen those conservation management measures and RFMOs. And congratulations on the updated National Plan of Action. So moving over to Lydia. So the question posed to Lydia is on the voluntary nature of IPOA-Sharks. Is this a barrier to implementation? And given the global state of shark stocks, should any future iterations move towards a more mandatory, treaty-based framework with built-in accountability mechanisms?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's a real honor sitting up here, especially amongst 4 other amazing women, and sorry, right? 5 other amazing women. God, it's been a long day, and I have to talk about law. So, yes, that was the question, and I guess there's a very short answer to this, which is it's not necessarily a barrier, but as we just heard, it's unfortunately outdated and not fit for purpose anymore. And the second part of this question was whether we need a binding treaty. Well, whether we want one or not, we probably won't get one. But a couple of people asked me, why do we actually have soft law? So for the benefit of the audience, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the difference between hard and soft law, or legally binding and non-binding, because you might not know and you might not be familiar why we even have such instruments. So soft law is usually quicker. It's easier to achieve, and it can facilitate compromise and account for uncertainty where some soft law instruments and processes often can't. When the IPOA for IUU, illegal, unreported, now I'm stuck, unmanaged, yeah, illegal, anyway. IUU fishing was negotiated, the EU actually referred to soft law as not a legal text, but a political text. So these instruments are generally aspirational in nature, and they draw attention to a problem and then suggest appropriate behavior or best practice to deal with it. But even though they are not binding and don't create obligations, and their language is often soft, as the name says, so they say encourage states or a state should. They are still negotiated in detail, and they drafted in an element of good faith commitment, and countries are still somewhat required or at least expected to adhere to them. And they can transition into hard law instruments. And over the past 30 years or so, we see an increase in those soft law instruments, specifically for those reasons. And there is also a legal discussion around whether some of those provisions that you see in soft law have now become customary international law and therefore are binding. And what that means, I'm happy to explain, but not right now. And I would like to click on the next slide. Oh, sorry, I've got it here. We talked about the CMS, and I'm not going to go into detail about that any longer, and we heard CITES, but one of the other instruments that we have is the CBD, and although it doesn't list species, there is a legal obligation to hold biodiversity loss and use resources in a sustainable way. And the CBD defines that by saying sustainable means in a way and at a rate that doesn't lead to long-term decline and saves those resources for present and future generations. And so the CBD is another instrument where sharks are important and relevant, and I just wanted to highlight this. The target 4, specifically on threatened species and their recovery, doesn't work in isolation, and it supports and works with all the other targets, and one of them is planning and creating new policies and making biodiversity part of decision-making. So, and I please ask you not to take any pictures, which is why the sign is up. What this map shows you here, and I'm not expecting you to read this, but what this shows you is some of the instruments we have in place that can consider sharks or their habitats and support shark conservation at both international level and at regional levels. And I think the Regional Seas Convention also have a role to play, and we haven't really talked about that, but Mona will give you an example of that. And what happens is that things that are negotiated in conservation frameworks should be carried forward by the countries into regional discussions and also into the RFMOs. And there are compliance mechanisms, and this was the second part of the question, the accountability mechanisms, or what you call in law, and non-compliance mechanisms. Why do we need them? Because they can identify barriers and causes of non-compliance early on. And they actually usually meant to be helpful, and they can clarify text and obligations and hopefully prevent disputes. Another interesting mechanism is the UNGA resolutions. You might have not heard that before, but there's a new review coming up. They are increasingly mentioning the IPOA and other soft laws, and that's a process where countries come together and also on consensus decide on priorities that countries should tackle and implement, and there's a reporting process. What's also important here is to understand, and Rima said this as well, these instruments don't work in isolation, they are linked. The CBD is working closely with the CMS. There was a resolution on ISRAS that countries have to consider it in their national biodiversity plan, strategies and action plans. And one thought-provoking comment I would like to make with this slide, there's more than one planning process where sharks can play a role. They can be marine spatial plans, blue economy roadmaps, recovery plans. We have a new obligation at EU level. So an NPOA is not the only plan where sharks can be integrated. And as we all know and heard, implementation happens at national level. And I guess for me, that's where the legal change also needs to happen, where laws need to be created to create enabling conditions to meet those obligations we already have. In many countries, and we at EU level often forget, there's not even the basic laws and the processes to update the laws to enable change. And this is also where law is enforced. So I'll leave it at this for the rest of the discussion. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and for the speed lesson on the different laws, and that we might need to think outside the box here. Okay, so moving on to Simone, please. Can you just click on for me, please? Thank you. And the question posed to Simone is, the Mediterranean Regional Plan encourages states to adopt national plans, but for many states that have yet to develop or update a national plan, do you think the primary barrier is a lack of scientific data, political appetite, and/or funding for implementation?
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you very much to the co-conveners for inviting me to this panel. And I can only just echo my colleagues here that it is a real pleasure to be at this panel. So the region that I'm working in, the Mediterranean region, so we have, first of all, to say we have a regional plan of action in place under UNEP, so under the Regional Seas Convention, the Barcelona Convention. We also have a second regional plan of action that is very important for sharks and rays. It is the Vulnerable Species Action Plan under the RFMO. So under the Regional Seas Convention, countries are actually encouraged to adopt the national plans, and there is a form of political commitment of the countries to do so, and this allows us also to see the level of implementation, because they send reports and they report about the blockages. So this is really also based on what the countries themselves report. So what does everyone think what the first answer is, what the blockage is? Funding and capacity. So no surprise here. But then the answer, of course, is not so simple, because there are other blockages that are indicated, and so funding capacity is really the one thing that every country reports. But then there is also lack of scientific data, and then there is actually political fragmentation. So we can talk about the political will in a second. About the scientific data. So one would think, because that's usually the second answer, yeah, we need more data. But the lack of some of the data is actually not such a blockage. It is not new, and there is actually a lot of work ongoing on this. And I see this often, that some countries they say, okay, this is a data poor country, but really, we really don't have so many data poor countries anymore. There's a lot of data that are being collected for decades already. And we see countries actually advancing when there is some processes in place. They can advance without having the perfect stock assessments in place. So if you have some monitoring systems in place, if you have some pilots on bycatch, so you can actually advance in the implementation. Then the lack of funding. Yes, it is important. You need funding to develop the plan, to do the consultation meetings properly, to do those workshops, and then obviously for the implementation. So this is for sure something that needs to be in place. But it's also more about the funding security. So for some countries, you have to think like adopting something in addition, and there is no financing mechanism for it. This is a high risk, because they are kind of reluctant then to do this, because there is a risk to fail. And last but not least, and I'm absolutely convinced that this is the biggest blockage for the adoption of the NPOAs, is the political fragmentation. So when we talk about political will, there is actually a basic political will already there, because those countries, they participate in the UNEP processes under the Regional Seas Convention. There's the action plan, it's really regularly updated. There's also the annexes that are regularly updated, and species are being added. There is also the RFMO, so there is a collaboration between the two regional frameworks. So this is happening. But what we can see is there is no clear mandate. There is a lack of coordination. So who's responsible? Who will adopt it? Who will do what? And so starting it and getting it adopted can be a real barrier. So this is the one important thing, and we see this in several processes that we are engaged. So in some countries, the draft has been in the drawer for 20 years and is now being picked up. A lot of consultation happened, and then it's being like ping-ponged around who's gonna take the responsibility for it and adopt it. Then what I like to do is I like to compare this, and I said this a couple of days ago, and the legal expert told me it's quite a fair comparison. So I like to compare National Plan of Action to a recipe. So when you know the Mediterranean, right? We're famous for our food. So you know Italian food, you know Lebanese food. I mean, it's the best in the world, in my opinion. You need the ingredients for a good recipe. And the Mediterranean kitchen is all about good ingredients. But then you also need the recipe. So the good ingredients would actually be the transposition of the proper hard law, as Lydia explained it. And then the recipe would be the soft law that actually tells you what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. So you can have the best ingredients if you have no clue what you put in the pan first and who has the role in the kitchen, it's gonna be a mess. So you're gonna burn the spaghetti. And this can be a delicious dish, but only in a very specific dish. So what we see in practice is that we have countries that are actually quite good in transposing the hard law. And there's actually no NPOAs in place. So you have the hard law in place, but then for sharks specifically, not so much is happening because there is no coordination and who's responsible. It's not a priority for fisheries because there's many other species that are much more prioritary, so they kind of fall through the cracks. Then we have other countries, and this is particularly true for the southern countries. It's very hard to pass new laws because of political instability, because of political priorities. So there, an NPOA can actually be a real enabler to create a momentum. And in those cases also, we were quite lucky to receive some funding. So thanks to the donors that are also in the room that allowed us in North Africa to actually use this tool to create the momentum, and that will hopefully pertain until we then also are able to pass the hard law. So with that, I would like to conclude, and I really see some meaning, and in the end, you need both, but the way you enter the process and then also making them more relevant, integrating them in the existing framework, making the stakeholders understand that this is not necessarily a new thing, it just tells you how to do the things. So you need to provide national plans of biodiversity action plans under the CBD, like Lydia said. Okay, so the NPOA is going to tell you how to include the sharks there. You have CMS that you need to provide, you need to have the ISRA, so this can help you to actually tick the boxes. So it should really be seen as a tool to help the countries do what they actually already need to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. Didn't think I was going to get a cooking lesson here today, but you know, in order not to go ahead and burn that spaghetti, we're now going to look further forward to the future. Can you move on? So this is obviously, you know, Monica. She's introduced herself from the FAO. So forward-looking, the question that is posed to Monica is, if we were to rewrite the International Plan of Action for Sharks today for the next 25 years, what is the most important element that was missing from the 1999 version, or what lessons can be learned to create a more effective global framework for chondrichthyan conservation?
Thank you, Sophie. First of all, when I received this question, I sent it to my colleague Kim Friedman, asking for advice from him, and so I received a message from him that makes a lot of sense to me. So, as each country is responsible for, as the text of the IPOA says, each country is responsible for developing, implementing, and monitoring. But we have seen significant progress that has been made in developing international and national policy framework. But a critical challenge now is to leverage this policy gain to a behavior change required to realize the intent. And so the risk to continue to produce more policy and also refine this policy is diminishing the returning for the biodiversity outcomes. So it's better, it's needed really to rebalance the investment toward the implementation and practice. This is, let's say, Kim's wordings. Okay, sorry. So referring to the lesson learned, if we enter into the country, as Simone also pointed out, there is the risk that the countries have never adopted the plan because of this lack of data, and we know that based on the principle of the precautionary approach, this is not acceptable. So the countries need to do a step, even if a plan is very, very easy and simple to improve a bit the situation. And then also we have seen
many times a conflict inside the countries for the authorities responsible for the different activities of the plan, and this stopped the adoption since the origin. So inside the countries there may be conflicts among institutions and among often the two main authorities responsible for fisheries and environmental, let's say. So in this regard, yes, the political willingness is essential, but it's essential also a transparent distribution of responsibility with regard to the action of the plan. What was missing, and due to the current situation and the different, all these new situation that we are facing, what we can do, we could eventually think about these same aims, the text of the IPOA-Sharks, trying to understand if new aims can produce a guidance with regard to the how to feed all the other international agreements that are more bindings, and Lydia and also Mona mentioned already this eventual let's say, practical, put into practice inside the countries some of these requirements for the international instruments, and create an ad hoc for country by country, could be, and also a regional level eventually. But here I'm not totally convinced about the regional. The regional process is very nice, but in terms of responsibility inside the countries, need to be really clear. Inside the countries, who is doing what and demand it. So I see a future possibility for a national plan of action, really for create an incentive to its adoption, giving a tool for reaching the targets of other international instruments. And this could be the main aim. So what we could do at the moment, what could be the way forward? We can call it an update, an additional guidance, as also Eric suggested in its paper. We can say about revamping the international plan of action, but how to do this? The member countries, the parties are very famous at country level. They need to support and be engaged in requesting to the Committee of Fisheries, so the FAO, some action in this regard. Because I think that we need to think about the procedure, the international procedure to create the possibility to update eventually this plan, and also take the opportunity to through this new tool, create these opportunities for the country to reply and comply with the other instruments. This is more or less my view. My view, not FAO view.
Thank you so much to Monica and Kim for that reply. So thanks for hanging in there with us. Now we've heard from our panel experts. We'd really like you to try and stay, please. And any questions from the floor, if you could make them as short as possible so we can get as many in as we can in the remaining time, please. And if you can, try and direct it to somebody on the panel. That would be helpful. Thank you.
All eyes on me on a discussion like this. Mostly towards Red, also maybe Simone to some extent. Could it be actually seen as an opportunity if a national plan of action is missing to implement a regional plan? Because you don't have to disentangle a national plan and then make it compatible with that regional plan. Or am I ignoring the individuality of a country and obviously the political will too much in this question?
Wow, that's a challenging question. I'll try to answer that from an East African perspective. And I think a national plan of action will probably be needed first, because When it comes to any kind of big political commitment to something, for example, a new proposal for CITES listings, if the information is presented to an East African government looking for commitment to support such a thing, they will immediately discuss that internally first, before going to discuss it multilaterally. Once they have a national position, they would then go and discuss it multilaterally. Once they've done that, they'll come back again and discuss it nationally again. And I think so having a national plan of action would probably be a simpler thing. Unless they are forced into a regional plan of action through a binding measure, for example, something like a regional fisheries management organization or something like that. But I would encourage a national plan of action first, I think. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I agree that it depends on the circumstances. And so the Mediterranean, for example, doing only national plans of action, this wouldn't make any sense because, I mean, the populations of sharks, most of them, they are transboundary. So we have basins that are so close to, where countries are so close to one another, you need this approach. Then the other aspect is we have a regional seas convention in place. So the regional seas convention has annexes of protected species and the action plan for chondrichthyan. That's how it's called. So it made sense because they have a monitoring framework, they have some associated decisions. So it's not a regional plan of action that stands on its own, and it's also very much important to coordinate North and South countries in our region because we have the EU countries and the non-EU member states. So I guess it depends on the circumstances.
Okay, are there any more questions out there for our panel? Yeah, Maria?
Thank you very much. My name is Maria José Juan Jordá. I work in the Spanish Oceanographic Institution. I think we're human beings, and it's very easy to criticize, 25 years later, these national plans of actions. I very much agree with Rima. We need to understand context. So my question to you, how the world would be now if these national plans of actions were not enacted 25 years ago? I know, I've seen the statistics. Many countries have not done them. Some countries have done them and they're old and they're not updated. But I think they had their role and they changed things. So how the world will be right now? As I've been listening to you, I was reflecting. I have my own ideas, but I would like to listen from you.
Thank you, Maria Jose. That's a very good point. And I think it catalyzed action. So we needed them. The question, I guess, is do we still need them when we have so many other agreements, when we have so many conventions that are now considering sharks and rays? So 25 years ago, we didn't have anything on CITES for sharks rays. We still don't have chimeras, but it's not really a problem yet. We didn't have many marine species listed on CMS. We didn't have any conservation management measures for sharks. So it did change the landscape. And that landscape now is moving at a momentum that is impressive. I think it's in parallel with the declines that we're seeing. But some countries still want them. And I think this is what we need to maybe wrap our head around, is it's a tool that exists. It's worked in certain cases. Some countries want to continue using them because it's easier, because there's structure, and because it's still a non-legally binding instrument, whereas others prefer using those legally binding instruments to move things forward at a faster pace. But they definitely made a difference.
Anybody else want to come in there? No? Okay. Conscious of the time, I think we will wrap it up there. And actually, just to pick up on your point there, Maria, the 25 years on, actually, we had to change the title to More Than 25 Years On, because we actually wrote this theme session 2 years ago. So it's been a while in the development, but I'm really pleased to actually see this come to fruition. I think it's been some challenging topics, and it's been really nice to hear everybody's viewpoints. There's definitely improvements to be made. It served a purpose, as you say, in the early days. I think it was a very powerful instrument, but it needs to be more coordinated across other frameworks.
But I think we've got some really good ideas here from everybody about how it could be improved going forward. So please, can you show your appreciation for our expert panel? Thank you. Okay, go and enjoy the poster session then. Thank you very much, everyone, for hanging in there.